Hey, thanks for clicking into this episode. We've got a special treat here with Mitch Brown, who is a professor at Arkansas. He is an expert in evolutionary psychology. And in this conversation, we discuss different markers of mate selection from different pressures like sexual selection. We get into the value of academic freedom. We discuss the nature of man, whether that's good and bad, whether it's tribal or cooperative, or maybe it's a little bit of both. And finally, and most importantly, we get into Southern wrestling. Enjoy this one. And we are on. All right, Mitch. So first of all, thanks a lot for hopping onto this thing. Professor at Arkansas of evolutionary psychology. Thanks again, Mitch Brown.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Hey, so I don't know if you know this about yourself, but back in the day, there was this thing called Rate My Professor, and I didn't even know it was still around. I was trying to find some of your papers. I searched Mitch Brown professor, and I found Rate My Professor, and I was like, what does Mitch have? Like I was not looking for it, but do you know what your own rating is?
Oh yeah. There's a degree of narcissism involved in this profession, and yes, I have a 5 right now.
You have a 5, a perfect score. I saw. But here's what I thought was hilarious though. First of all, I saw you teach a number of different courses, but one of the comments that your students left is hilarious, great class, learned a ton, curses like a sailor, and I thought that's phenomenal.
Yeah. Just being a product of a northern state and getting really passionate about things. I don't think that I'm that profane with what I do, but I have no problem with working a bit blue if it's going to capture their attention. And the thing is, I for that I remember that class more specifically. Damn it if they didn't actually learn the material that well.
Yeah, was that an undergrad class or a grad class?
That was undergrad, definitely undergrad.
All right. I don't know. I could imagine a grad class appreciating a professor that's cussing left and right. I mean, I think grad students are less likely to take it seriously, whereas undergrads they will not be deterred by that. Like I think as an undergrad, if you hear someone using profane language, you might even be apt to give them more authority. Just being that age where you're like, oh man, this guy is just throwing around like the F word, F bombs left and right. He must be serious.
Yeah, well, so a lot of that's very strategic actually. So there are times, well, especially for a lot of younger students, they're coming in, they may not necessarily have much background with a range of perspectives. I do try to say, I'll strategically say the word fuck sometimes just to make sure that they recognize that this is a college experience, to recognize that, just like that they're adults, that I'm going to take them seriously as human beings, and just let them know like that this is how the real world works sometimes. And it just, and truthfully, well, a lot of my classes I cover, more mature topics, and I want to try to lighten the mood and just set the tones, especially on that first day. I mean, there have been times when, in evolutionary psychology, I mean, a lot of what I talk about it is sex, mating behaviors, relationships. So you kind of need that, or also too, like as an example for intro to psych. I mean, I'm kind of wrist locked into teaching Freud a bit, and you have to
Mm.
cover a lot of Freud. And the idea here with just talking about Freud sometimes is you have to talk about the fact that he had a very unhealthy relationship with his family. There's a lot of talk of sex, and basically, if we can go over all those kinds of things and then just talk about all the things coming out of his dirty mind, we can then use that as a springboard to say, hey guys, this really isn't that good of science, and let me explain why that is. And now you can start to figure out, what has merit, what doesn't, critical thinking, and all that. And if I can disarm them by talking about things in a more mature way, being a bit more risque, I've noticed that people are just going to engage the topic more.
I've actually noticed this about. So I mean, I studied mechanical engineering through and through. I don't think I've taken a single psych class in my life. I mean, I think it's a fascinating field, like, especially when I came across evolutionary psychology. I think I mentioned earlier the first time I really came to read a book on that or to understand at least the concept of evolutionary psychology was through. Oh yeah, I mentioned it. I think I read a David Buss book, The Evolution of Desire, after a breakup, where I was like, I gotta figure out the science of this thing. But beyond that, it's funny because you'll hear from people who have maybe just taken the intro to psych class as part of their undergraduate curricula where they may end up holding someone like Freud in high esteem, but that's because they learn about him in that one semester that they take, and then they kind of fall off there. And you're like, well, he's got a lot of interesting ideas. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, like a couple of his ideas do hold in terms of the layering of how deep we think about things, but then a lot of it falls apart when you think about like, oh, not everything is connected to sex. I mean, like you could we're going to get into this. There's a lot that is driven by sexual selection and mate desires, but that's not nearly the whole story of psychology. Am I getting that right?
You are. So the big thing that I like to do, at least with psych majors, is there's a concern over the great person approach. So oftentimes we have the great minds, the great theorists who were foundational for psychology. So Freud, James, Skinner, Watson, all certainly big names, but at the same rate, though, they are still people, and their ideas are still ostensibly fallible. And I try really hard to push out my class to say that yeah, these are important people. It's good for you to know their names, but also to remember that we can't necessarily be wed to an idea because of a person. It's the again what's we call it the great person approach, and I try really hard to steer people away from that. And the thing is, really about Freud, a lot of his ideas do have a degree of veracity to them. So the defense mechanisms, there's actually evidence for almost each one of them, except for sublimation, but not necessarily in the same vein that Freud was saying originally. So the idea of there being some kind of psychic steam engine that's cathecting energy, that's those are all just language of his time, and there's no real predictive basis to that. But at the same time, though, the idea being that people are trying to protect themselves from recognizing their own shortcomings, yeah, there's pretty good evidence of that, just not necessarily the way that Freud said it was. And oftentimes, what I try to do is I try to divorce the person from the idea because, again, sometimes the idea has some merit to it, and there are a lot of good ideas that can emerge from things that could be considered discredited. We still see this in modern context. I would rather not throw the baby out with the bathwater and just ignore this idea entirely, just because one set of ideas provide evidence against a claim for just frankly a small set of possible outcomes, and just what honestly research without much experimental control behind it. Oh, I said it out loud.
Yeah, you're in a difficult field of evolutionary psychology where I mean you just talked about like is this informative or not? I think one of the biggest criticisms that your field gets thrown is that does this predict anything? And it only predicts the obvious. And you're like, well, those two things are actually opposite of each other, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
Is it a real science or not? I think it is. There's a reason I want to chat with you. But I think you guys live in this like very difficult world where you're living in the evidence. And so when you come up with theories and you come up with ideas, it's almost like it's that classic explanation of does a fish know what water is? It's like, well, do we know where our environment and surroundings came from, and I really like the breakdown of comparing, say, genetics versus memetics in terms of both having like evolutionary impact and sort of the cultural way that we might experience something, where some traits are universal and others are not, and I that gets into controversial topics real quick. I want to get into some of the work that you've done, but since you mentioned crowding, I was not aware that this was I hadn't thought at all about any sort of natural instinct, and I'll tell you this. So there's an entire ecosystem of these crazy music festivals that are insanely crowded. It's just shoulder to
Hmm.
shoulder.
Yep.
And I was just talking to a coworker about this. I have zero desire of attending these. I think I can't even remember. I'm pretty sure I've gone to like a couple like this, but I have zero desire to go into it. For the most part, I just don't like the discomfort of it. I'm too old to be uncomfortable these days. But part of it is also like there's always something in the back of my mind, like if something goes wrong, you're trapped. It's like a feeling of claustrophobia. And I remember actually this was a few years ago now, but it made the news. There was a concert. I think it was in South Korea. There was a massive concert or something on in Seoul, and the concert like was kind of an open street concert, and there ended up being about I think 20 to 30 people passing away because they just couldn't breathe in the crowd. They got trapped in something crazy like that.
Yeah, 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 definitely. Yeah. So what you're describing, now there's quite a bit of research on this. So there's been, at least for the past decade, a lot of anti-stampeding research. So how if someone's in a crowd, how do we ensure that people can do things safely? That's it's not necessarily what I've done. But there's a big dearth actually for a while of crowding research where it was kind of a thing in the 70s, kind of thing in the early 80s. Basically, how do people respond if they're in these like environments where proximity boundaries are violated? What you're describing is basically, you recognizing that just a mass of people as a threat. I think most people do actually. I mean that concept sounds incredibly unpleasant and likely is kind of uh, but an impetus for other research to figure out how do we make sure that people don't get trampled at these things. Again, there's a lot of research in disaster prevention about how do we prevent stampedes from happening. Uh, in terms of my research on crowding, so these ideas started while I was still in grad school. It was about 8 years ago when this happened. I just read this great paper looking at the interplay between proximity violation and disease avoidance, where if individuals felt pathogenically threatened, they would actually view crowds as more threatening entities themselves. And just because at the time I was interested in this interplay between saturation of pathogen avoidance and affiliated motives, I thought, what if I were to flip this? And that came up with an idea of how do crowds actually uh, foster people's perceptions of disease in their environment. So just a handful of studies where I made people think about themselves either in a crowd or in a very wide open place. Just kind of write your thoughts down. Uh, when you look at how people responded in the former conditions, so feeling like they're crowded, the writing was beautiful. It was so unpleasantly written, and it basically just people thought about the fact that they were in these very tightly compacted areas, and what we ultimately saw actually was over multiple studies that people were reporting more concerns about pathogens. They were reporting themselves as feeling more vulnerable to getting infected. They well, they didn't necessarily like more people when they weren't crowded, but they were tolerating people who didn't have obvious disease cues in their faces. And my personal favorite one, this is the one that I feel was, quite nifty. When you make people think about disease, they actually have a heightened preference for facial symmetry, or so we already prefer symmetry quite a bit in faces, but that preference just increased by that much more.
That's really interesting, especially in terms of I would not have put in the crowd like avoiding a crowd for disease prevention together. And I'm thinking about this and historically, yeah, I mean, we've seen like indigenous South America wiped out 400 years ago because
Mhm,
of disease, right? Like that
mhm,
threat is very real. But what's interesting is like, I mean, in modern society, especially living in America, the last thing I think about is like getting caught by a disease. I mean, our sanitation and hygiene has just taken a whole different level in our day to day. But it is interesting that like cultural societies historically have put some value on cleanliness.
mhm.
And it was always, I mean, for a long time that was just like it was a godly thing, right? There was not a scientific understanding of hey, these are germs. This is like bacteria. There's these microscopic things that pass from one person to person. I mean, I think there's this story of they didn't even like doctors didn't start cleaning their hands until I want to say the 1850s or something after giving birth. So, and it started, I believe it was in Vienna, somewhere in Central Europe. A doctor would give birth to, or he would help deliver a baby. He would go to the next room, deliver the next baby. And then a nurse was like, "Hey, what if we start cleaning our hands?" And there's a lot of pushback because you're like, you don't question the doctor. And I think in Vienna or something, they started cleaning their hands, and they're like, "Hey, our birth rate, the deaths after birth have decreased by a massive amount because we did this simple thing called cleaning our hands." But anyway, that's an interesting thing because like we're talk to someone from 2,000 years ago, they don't know what disease is. Diseases were something that were passed down by bad luck.
Yeah. Germ theory is it's such a critical, one of the most important theories, of our times. Actually, I would argue that the microscope is one of the most important inventions of the modern day. Disease is just such a pervasive, ubiquitous thing, and even though we can't necessarily see pathogens, I mean, we have these heuristic understandings as to what they ultimately are, and that likely did shape, the way that we engage people through natural selection. We're trying to identify, physical cues that are putatively diagnostic of, somebody's illness. trying to identify who could possibly, be harmful for us. Yeah, just yeah, I mean, going back to this idea of cleanliness and purity rituals, what we actually see now with available data is that in countries where there are higher pathogen loads, we typically see social norms that are more interpersonally restrictive. There are cultural structures designed in the service of maintaining the sense of purity and cleanliness. You can think about along the lines of if you live in an environment where there's a lot of disease transmission, people like we aren't going to want to go around touching everyone. And I've found this, other labs have found this, that there's greater interpersonal reticence when disease is salient. But if you were to look at that on a broad systemic level, the idea being that your society just is in an environment where there's a lot of disease, we see lower levels of extroversion. We see, greater restriction on sexual norms. It just we see greater conformity in a lot of these environments, and just for the most part here, just we see this set of cultural rules designed to keep things clean, keep things pure. We see just as an example, and well, we can think about this in terms of handedness actually. So when we have the right hand, the right hand. This is the correct hand, whereas the left hand, this is the one that's left over. I mean, the Latin word sinister, being left-handed. So there's this aversion to being left-handed because historically, in a lot of instances, for lack of a better phrase here, the left hand in a lot of cultures is the wiping hand, and basically you're in a scenario where shaking hands with your left hand is considered impolite, not correct, possibly pathogenic. So there's actually, at least in some societies, the ones that have higher levels of disease, there's greater instances of people who report being right-handed. They're probably not really right-handed. I mean, in the 50s in the U.S., there was a lot of this push to make the lefties righties. But just so we oftentimes see actually in these countries where there's just more disease, there's just a greater interest in making sure that your kid actually ends up using the so-called right hand because it's just more the conducive to following social rules that could have ostensibly emerged to keep everyone clean.
Yeah, these are sort of things that you have to like step outside of your environment to like make any sense out of. Yeah, but the whole left-handed thing, like I'm still trying to wrap my head around how that exists. Like when you're a kid, when I was growing up, at least there was like 3 or 4 desks for left-handed people. But they were accepted in my day. But I know, yeah, even I think just 30 years before they were there was more of an attitude that if you're an elementary school teacher and you see your student drawing with his left hand, you immediately just kind of force them to draw with the right. But
Yeah, yeah. There's then the consequences. We have a lot of kids who write things diagonally for the rest of their lives.
it's art. It's art now. It's calligraphy. Um, I wanna get into some of your work. So you've mentioned a few things that we could bounce around, but it seems like your latest work is more on formidability and the perception of formidability. And I think this is that perfect example where, in terms of evolutionary psychology, it's like, well, um, what 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 is the ultimate conclusion out of these things? Like how are we drawing the line from going from the perception of formidability being a positive to that's something that's in our bones, right? And like,
Sure.
is that and I am curious about your thoughts on this. Like, how do you separate, say, genetics versus memetics? Because I think both of those fall in evolutionary psychology, even though they're complete like they're quite different in their source. And
Sure. Yeah.
the implications are the implications kind of tell you how to think about them, I think.
Yeah, well, I think about it along the lines of genes are largely in the service of potentiating certain responses, and likely selection favored those who had a genetic potential to infer certain things with a degree of accuracy or consistency. Even if it's not accurate, you're still inferring something pretty consistently. So, in the case of formidability, maybe just for the sake of this example, we can consider men's upper body strength. So, men with broad shoulders, the tapered waist, the V-shaped yoked up dudes, maybe the idea here is you're noticing just a consistent pattern here. You're saying these features coming together, this is ostensibly diagnostic of somebody who has a high degree of upper body strength. This is someone who could do some damage in physical conflict. This person could be possibly threatening, and likely on a genetic level, people may be potentiated to view these cues in concert. I mean, we kind of view things in a configuration anyway, just by virtue of the fact that we're trying to piece these together, top down processing. Uh, so we're trying to put everything together here. Uh, and just those who can identify these features in this specific configuration, maybe this could have, benefited them somehow. And these individuals, either they could have avoided possible threats, they could have viewed someone as a viable coalitional ally or a mating opportunity. So those who were sensitive to these things, they were less likely to be exploited, therefore, more likely to reproduce and pass on this potential for for this awareness of these features together. So this ability to configure in that capacity, that likely does have a genetic component to it. On a mimetic level, I'd say, they are necessarily intertwined. The idea being that, I mean, if people are genetically potentiated to identify these things, at least my speculation would be there would be some kind of cultural script that could emerge here to identify, well, what is the language that we're using? So a lot of times these trait inferences we use for people, these are still largely based on folk language, these linguistic distinctions that we're trying to uh, designate to and just this form of things coming together. And if we can form it together and have a label for it, at least on a mimetic level, the idea is that we're noticing these things, but we that can uh, label things appropriately just based on what these cultural norms are.
Yeah, I think that's one of the difficulties is it's so easy for them to get intertwined. Where say the genetics causes the mimetics, and then there's we were chatting. I was reading Steve Stewart Smill's book, and he mentions I can't remember the specific examples, but he does mention the opposite where there could be mimetics driving genetics. And he gave I think music was an example, which is
Yep.
to me that's mind blowing because all right, genetics is something that we've accepted and correct anything that I say that's wrong. Genetics is something that we've accepted that takes generations to develop, right? Especially in humans. We're talking say let's say 30, on average, let's say 30 years per generation. If you want to get genetic drive towards any sort of mutation or genetic selection, we're talking like 5, 6, 7, 10, 20 generations. That's a long
Mhm.
time. Whereas
Wow.
mimetics, 1 year, right? 1 year is all it takes. Like, I have some questions on AI, but AI is one of those things where it's like 1 year to go from,
You cut
nothing
out
to
there,
like
Hugh.
where it's taken off or, dancing on TikTok. That was nothing and now that's like a thing. That's the perfect example of a meme where that's mimetics that has just turned around in like the blink of an eye. And so you have these 2 different time scales. And so it makes a lot of sense for me to think that, okay, a long-term, long-lasting mimetic change is going to ultimately dry or I should say it the other way. Something inherent in our genetics is gonna be able to drive, say, like, a meme. But the other hand, it's very surprising because for mimetics to drive genetics, this is 2 completely different timescales. One is, like, high speed, the other is low speed. So your cultural advent has to stick around for a very long, long term over multiple generations and for your genes to catch up and ultimately feed back onto it.
Yeah. No. 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 You're absolutely right there. Yeah. So something I don't necessarily think of one always coming first compared to the other. It's I always I think about it along the lines of like a degree of reciprocity. So there's both internal and I'd say there's genetic and social potentiation. I very rarely will I ever say that it's always one or the other for every single thing. I tell this to my students all the time: nature and nurture, it's both, and that's kind of the way I approach it myself. So in the example of music, that's certainly just an example of just at least on a mimetic level, things are just emerging through that cultural evolution. Things are kind of popping up in this capacity where uh, how it's we're every few months. I mean, new things are just kind of emerging. So there is always that transmission, and I think that at least on a biological level here, we could possibly go back to the idea being that those who are able to make music well, I mean, those traits have a degree of attractiveness, and yeah, likely speaking, if someone is, genetically inclined to, do the process of what we would know as music, they likely get those traits, passed on, and then at least at that point, we have individuals who can engage, the cultural script of music, and then they could actually progress things on this mimetic level almost instantaneously. Actually,
See, this is where it gets confusing because we were just talking about upper body strength, and you're like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. We're just getting out of our ape stage, and we're still hunting, we're still gathering. We got to be able to like climb trees, protect ourselves against foes, against predators, and we have to be able to catch prey. there's a lot of value in having strength. What is the value of being able to sing and play guitar? Why is the lute why is the lutist this, a rock star and let's say able to spread their seed more so.
Well, so I don't know if it's the loot as much as those pantaloons because you get to see that look at their calves, man. Look at they look so good in the tights.
Hmm.
But I would say at least with in terms of like musical ability, the idea here is just it's a cognitive skill. So I mean, and the thing is like there's a whole host of thoughts as to how this could potentially emerge. I would recommend maybe some work from Jeffrey Miller as kind of like a nice springboard from that too. Just kind of the idea being that if someone's able to create music, someone could likely have a degree of creativity to them. Oftentimes with with this intelligence or creativity that you could be inferring through this, you may think to yourself, well, maybe well, this must be heritable, so maybe our children could inherit some of these intelligence, creativity genes themselves. Also too, someone who's highly creative, someone who's highly intelligent, as an example for women evaluating men, they could think to themselves, well, if I'm going to, carry offspring, this person who's maybe quite creative, maybe this person is, able to afford more resources for our pair bond for our offspring. This is one of many several options, but at least on a heuristic level, maybe you're inferring to yourself, this person could actually contribute to my pair bond much more readily. So musicality could actually show a way to engage things in this creative fashion, being able to demonstrate that you're able to make something from what's ostensibly nothing. I mean, that's music kind of has that magical quality to it.
Hmm.
So are you able to generate things, and is what is that saying about you? Like, are you
Hmm.
inferring something that maybe your offspring could inherit, and maybe this person could help offset your staggering reproductive costs historically if you're a woman, just because historically so much reproduction fell of the reproductive costs fell on women's shoulders.
Yeah, that's so interesting because musical genres are so widely varied, right? Like even if we just think about the kind of music made today, but now if we compare that to say over the last like 2000 years, like if we listen to classical music, the big orchestras, if we go back further beyond that, where there's the trope of that like traveling musician who's just playing on their lute going from bar to bar and just survive like
Mhm.
the Robert Johnson
Yep.
extracted backwards in time. But it's you would yeah, I mean it's true. You'd be hard pressed to find anyone that says no, I just do not like music.
One could potentially say that what is the ancestral relevance for it? So, what kind of fitness enhancement can occur with that? So, yeah, I definitely buy into a lot of the peacocking with music. I mean, you are able to do these things. It is costly. It is, the idea being that if you're going to make music, you're that kind of does say something about you, but also too, just because you're making music doesn't necessarily mean that it's good music. I really hope I don't offend any of your friends here. Basically, the idea being that Five Finger Death Punch makes a lot of music, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's good. Uh, but compare that then to just I mean, again, I'm gonna out myself here. Listening to a really sick Steve Vai solo. I mean, that's gonna be probably sure. Not only are you saying that I could do these things, I can expend these resources with little ancestral relevance, but can I do this competently? And I feel like that's oftentimes a bit of a gap with a lot of these signaling things that just yeah, you got a signal, but also too the signal actually has to kind of be high quality with it.
Well, I'm with you on the '60s vibe thing because I just started reading Life by Keith Richards, and like his opening chapter is kind of referring to like, hey, this is the British invasion. It's these dudes with long hair that kind of have a bit of like a in the '60s they were coming in with a bit of a feminine vibe, but somehow they were still like attracting a lot of women, and like Americans were like, well, I don't know what's going on here, and looking back in retrospect is different. But I did want to come back a little bit more to the whole formidability studies. So you mentioned upper body strength. I have to ask, why should we skip legs day, Mitch?
Well, you
What do
should.
you have against legs day?
So you should never skip leg day. A good friend will tell you not to skip leg day. It's going to keep you keep you from tipping over. That's the most important part. I skipped leg day one time, and I'm a human trapezoid, so I'm gonna fall over sometimes. Uh, But in terms of with the importance of upper body strength, a lot of it is just you can think about it from like a mechanical standpoint. So we evolved to stand up straight, we evolved to look ahead, and basically part of that is like what's the easiest thing to look at someone? It's their face. Yeah, no, the face is informative. It has a lot of important social cues to it, but also too, it's not necessarily the most precise, not necessarily the most perfect way to infer information. What's probably more appropriate is, well, at least in terms of immediacy, your upper body. And for the most part
Mm,
here, we can notice it much more readily. So we're noticing these cues more. And at the same time, too, actually with upper body, at least historically, that's where most conflict started. So if you're gonna throw a punch, you're gonna grapple with someone, you're gonna throw them up over you. Well, that's all upper body strength. This isn't necessarily saying that lower body strength isn't important. It certainly can be, but most physical conflict historically involved upper limbs and just being able to hold people and hit them. In that case, we weren't necessarily trained to do a bunch of leg kicks in our ancestral environment. I mean, I love a good leg kick, but I don't necessarily see Homo neanderthalis actually, throwing some really sick way to take someone down that way. A lot of it was basically selection favoring just this upper body strength and your ability to control from above, and those were the ones who won those historical contests.
I see. So it's more visually available. It's you see that a lot quicker than you see like you're not checking out a dude's like quads. And is this a one way? Um yeah, is this a one way street? Like is it women seeing that men have upper body strength and then like having visual cues take off, or is it going the other direction as well
Oh,
to
yeah,
a degree?
yeah, there's a degree of both of that too. It's just the idea is that I mean, so both men and women are noticing somebody's upper body strength. It shows like, well, for women it's possibly a prospective mate. For men it could be an intersexual rival. For both of them too, it could also be is this person a strong coalitional ally if they're part of my in group. So there are both sex specific and sex general perceptions of our upper body strength that could be driving a lot going on here. That's certainly part of that process. But also too at the same rate, at least among physically strong men, there is awareness of their social capital, and we see this calibration of their interpersonal style to recognize what they can and can't do, and their ability to engage other people, and we actually see so in addition to this attractiveness for upper body strength men, we actually see men kind of calibrate their reproductive strategies based on the fact that they recognize that they are intersexually competitive and largely attractive.
Hmm. Something I was thinking about was going back to the Greek statues. Like they did some the artwork that they were capable of it just really blows my mind. But if you look at at like the gods, the Greek gods that were essentially like in humanoid form, um if a male looks at one of those today, it's like, "Oh, I wanna achieve that." That's the body that I wanna achieve, and it's the same body over, like, 2,000 years, whereas, like, yeah, okay, you want low body fat. You want to have a lot of toned muscles throughout, and that kind of stays static, right? That's the unrealistic goal that men would like to achieve.
Oh yeah.
But I was thinking about this for women, where I well, let me give one exception though. And I do need to I do need to verify this to be fair, which is I think there was a period in the medieval ages where if you're a man and you're obese and overweight, that was actually considered attractive. And I think that was a mimetic thing where the idea was, well, if you're fat and overweight, that means you're doing very well in life, right? Like a lot of people in the medieval ages, there were so many farmers that were just struggling to survive. So
Yeah.
most people were quite slim.
Yeah.
Um, so that was a bit. I don't know if I want to say exceptional or what, but
It's very I won't say exceptional. I would say that's very context specific, and in other societies, this is something that does emerge too. Actually, so in environments where there is resource scarcity, having higher levels of adiposity, such as more body fat, that does indicate access to resources. That does indicate a degree of just metabolic advantages. So there's some work showing actually that if we make men think about resource scarcity and just they're from a lower socioeconomic class, we actually see them having a higher preference for body fat on women actually. So like, there is this, basically again, body fat does show access to resources. It shows possible advantages. The idea here is like, I mean, if a higher degree of body fat in some areas could indicate that pregnancies will be successful, that offspring could have a greater chance of surviving into adulthood. Now they're not thinking about that directly, but that seems to be a
Mhm.
bit of a long term consequence, which could be a proximal reason as to why these features could be attractive. But also too, even with the fact that like people can kind of calibrate their value of body fat in different degrees, it's also heavily contextual based on where that body fat could potentially be. So,
Mhm.
oftentimes, at least among men's evaluation of women, a lot of like gluteofemoral areas. So, yeah, yeah, the kids would say someone who is THICC thick. That's ridiculous, but basically yeah, legs, hips. If there's more body fat there, that's considered more attractive versus body fat that's more concentrated. More in the abdomen. Basically, whatever could potentially contribute to at least with women, a relatively narrow waist compared to wider hips. So even for so we see this with the waist to hip ratio. So a feature that's oftentimes considered attractive, regardless of BMI, to where if you have greater units of waist relative to hip, as long as you have that ostensibly optimal ratio, that's not necessarily like a ratio that evolved itself, more like the components of it. Women still are seen as attractive, regardless of what their body fat is, and largely that body fat cue is going to be something that'll be more or less desirable based around environmental factors.
That's Yeah, that's super interesting. It really brings together that idea that we were talking about earlier, where is it the drive of culture, nature versus nurture, and it sounds like it's almost cyclical in this particular case. I mean, I'm an optimist. I'm an optimist living in America, so I would like to believe that we're going to live in an abundant age for the rest of our lives, and hopefully for the rest of human society, which could perhaps lead to a permanent change in these cycles. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting to look at artwork throughout the ages to see what is the ideal male, what is the ideal female, and who is being prized and to consider for what ways. But yeah, I mean, even today, like we live in a world with a lot of different socioeconomic ranges. So I imagine that's how some of these studies were carried out, where they looked at subset of populations and said, hey, in this population, what physique is prized? And that's a very interesting way to look about at it, because it's like it's something that I don't think about. Like if I see a woman who I think is attractive, it's just there's no thought process to it. There's no calculation. I'm not like mentally taking out a ruler and like, oh, what is the right measure? Am I seeing the facial symmetry? Hold on, like it's built in, and it's something that I presumably, and you learn this when you hang out with your male friends. You're like, oh, we all have different tastes, and sometimes they get closer, sometimes a little bit further away. I'm sure for women it's the same thing, and in fact, I think there's a lot of like studies, especially from Okay, Cupid, for example, I think had like a book that came out 15 years ago, which is probably it would not be published today. It would be immediately canceled.
Yep.
But 10, 15 years ago, it came out and it was showing a lot of differences between men and women in how they evaluate potential partners and for what ends, right? Oh, so that's another big thing. And I don't know, like, I don't want to get too much into it. Well, actually, I might touch on a few other things that I want to chat with you about, which is short term and long term mate selection. um it's funny because that's one of those things where culturally you're like, oh yeah, I would date him or her for a week or two, but like that's not someone who I'd want to be the parent to my children. And like always thought about this as a cultural thing, like, oh, that's just our culture kind of being a little bit weird. And then you see sort of the hypothesis from evolutionary psychology, and even different the ways that different mating structures were set up in different cultures, especially written stuff historically. It's like, oh, okay, I kind of see how these differences in selection could come about. But and I'll just put out one last disclaimer, which is like, and I'm sure this is something that you think about often, which is how many of these ideas do we want to take to the extreme? How many of them do we say like, oh, okay, men are just big brutes. We just have to let them be big brutes versus, a stereotypical woman where we don't want to box people in, because I don't think that is an
No.
advancement either.
No, no. So with that point, actually, what you're getting at here is, we don't want to lean into the naturalistic fallacy. So just because something is natural doesn't necessarily mean that it's good, that it should be prescribed, that we should all follow it. Just because men are physically larger and are historically more prone to aggressive behavior, that doesn't mean we should excuse aggressive behavior for men. I mean, historically, we really didn't. We recognize the cost of that, and maybe some ways we would tolerate it because these guys could be coalitional allies for an outgroup threat, but also too, we see ostracism for highly aggressive behavior. We see, well, historically, there could be executions of people who are overly aggressive. So, just because there's a biological underpinning of it doesn't necessarily mean that we should tolerate or excuse it, and just recognize that the certain behaviors may be more typical of one group versus another. And if there's a mismatch with our modern environment and how we evolved, I mean, we're well justified to try to uh, uh, address this and try to mitigate that. One example I like to give my students in terms of something biological that's not necessarily good, or at least good long term, cystic fibrosis. So during the plague, cystic fibrosis was a trait that just randomly popped up that seemed to be a bit of a buffer against getting the plague. So people who had cystic fibrosis, they weren't getting the plague, and they had more chances to reproduce before they died. And they would do that, and they'd pass on these genes. And during these times, I mean, before cystic fibrosis would kill you, typically like mid to late 20s, people would have already reproduced. So there was no selection pressure against these traits. Obviously, in modern time, no plague, we can live a lot longer. Reproduction is delayed. We recognize that cystic fibrosis is, it was never a good thing. But it's just one of those things that just it creates a lot of complications for people. And just the thing is, it's still evolved, yet it produces a lot of challenges. If we want to take one step further, just as an example here, there is an evolutionary argument for why child abuse or maltreatment that can occur sometimes, particularly toward stepchildren, adopted children, children to whom one has no genetic relation. Some people may know this as the Cinderella effect, and it just just in general, uh, children to whom you have no biological relation, they tend to be more vulnerable to maltreatment and harm. And just just because historically you have no genetic relation to them, there's less likely interest in protecting protecting one's fitness through that offspring. So no, it's historically just there'd be less care toward them. Doesn't mean it's a good thing. Doesn't mean I mean, harming someone is always bad, and, just child abuse is a terrible thing. Yet we still have these biological, underpinnings that may make us more, potentiated toward aggressive behavior. And if that's the case, then, what can we do to stop that? How can we, recognize these things and prevent, actual harm from befalling someone?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent way to put it. I see the world a lot more in a probabilistic nature these days, which is to say, anything and everything that happens has some probability of happening.
Mhm.
And I think
Yeah,
this, like the Cinderella effect, is a great example of that, where what you're not saying that a stepfather is going to harm their children. That's not what you're saying.
absolutely.
What you're saying
Not
is
at
that
all.
the probability, if there's abuse, the probability is higher.
Yes,
Um,
exactly, yeah. Yep, yep.
yeah, and
Most step parents I know are fantastic human beings. Just, just probabilistically, it's more likely to be a step parent than a biological parent.
right, and the order of magnitude that we're talking here is something like, order of magnitude is something like 0.1% to like 0.5%, right? Like it's very small absolute
Yeah.
percentages. It could possibly be less than that. But then it's saying like, okay, well, you can at least be sort of preventative in thinking about it, or you could say, look, I just got to increase my monitoring of this situation a little bit more,
Yeah,
so that you're
and
ready to step in.
yeah, and even then too, like, most of this so-called mistreatment is not necessarily physical abuse. Sometimes it's just a matter of neglect, or I don't even want to say neglect in a bad way. Just like you're not as vigilant toward that offspring compared to if it were biological. So like, even then, a lot of these effects, these are even though they're still statistically significant. A lot of times it's the actual like nefarious things are still incredibly rare in the end.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like, if I would say the practical takeaway of understanding something like Cinderella effect would be, say, like, if you've got a child and you're a single parent, then when you select your mate, you just need to be aware that, listen, there's you have to select more. You have to have a stronger filter, and these are things to be watch out for. You have to be aware of this so that you make the right decision for your kid, right? And that's something that, like, if you're a parent of a single if you're a single parent, it might not go through your head that, okay, you need to like really ramp up the relation, how you view the relationship between your potential new long-term mate and your child. And
Mhm.
like there's a little bit more risk that you need to pick up. So there's a couple more things that I mean, there's a lot of things actually that I want to chat with you about. I don't know if we're gonna get through them all, but when we think about formidability, I was thinking the first thing that came to my mind was this halo effect, where in today's society, where like, look, I'm not gonna if I'm gonna use any strength and selection, it would be like lifting someone's bags into the overhead bin at an airport, but I'm not hunting. I'm not fighting for survival. I'm not really using strength in any practical way in terms of like mate attraction. Right. And I think most males can say that. Like, unless you're an MMA fighter or something, most of our society is, we could call it fortunate or what, but m- muscles don't really, they're not as valued as they used to be. We live in an economy that has so many other ways of being successful, some more
Mhm.
than others.
Yeah.
So, but I do think the halo effect is very real. I think it's something you see with your own eyes. It's something that maybe you've experienced in one way or another. Um, but that's a very fascinating thing. So, like, when I saw your stuff on facial symmetry, that's what came to mind. It's like, all right, well, you the benefit of I don't know, I think they call it looks maxing these days. The benefit of bone smashing, which
Oh my god.
sounds horrendous. I don't think it's actually smashing of the bones, fortunately.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. Well, so it's also not anything actually scientific. These are people who have taken a lot of these ideas super literally, and they don't recognize just what they're actually doing. So, like at least historically, with like masculinized features, these are features that are potentiated through like prenatal and adolescent androgen exposure. So, more masculinized features. That like a great paper from 10 years ago showing that there's like umbilical cord androgen levels. They predict more masculinized features in male faces. These are things that are hard to fake historically. There was no plastic surgery in ancestral times, so it's basically what these people are trying to do is that they're trying to uh, best way in the most literary sense possible. They're trying to play God with basically just what they think is biologically optimal. But the problem is they don't really understand like why these features kind of emerge in the first place. So when we're talking about like facial ratios, it's unlikely that these ratios were specifically selected. I don't think that in ancestral times there was a caveman with a pair of calipers trying to measure the distance between your zygomaticus and your cheek razor. So they were likely not doing those kinds of things. But likely what happened was all these features that they were all independently selected. Now we're just aware of what this ratio could look like as optimal based on that. So these people are trying to use these arbitrary ratios with, plastic surgery that's still very much imperfect, and they end up, in many instances, kind of looking silly, and they're creating a fake signal. Then, so the idea being that I mean, um, oftentimes in like real mating markets, people will make trade offs. So even though you don't necessarily have the best look about you, maybe you're really nice, maybe you're really funny. I had to lean into being funny sometimes. But my beefy neck can only get me so far. But at the same time, though, uh, they're ignoring the fact that a lot of mating decisions. So in isolation, a lot of these features can be desirable, but they also don't understand like the origins, or they don't appreciate why these features are desirable in the first place. And they're not considering the fact that these are trade-offs that people are making in their decisions. Kind of like why dating apps are kind of like falling off now is because we're not mirroring the ancestral environments where trade-offs could be made, and we end up with everyone just trying to take evolutionary theory so literally that they're kind of missing the point. And then now we have a society of people who are just falling for the naturalistic fallacy, and we have a lot of women who are pissed that they don't have someone who's over 6 feet, which is it's like women want a taller man, but they don't. But the 6 foot rule is a very cultural arbitrary thing. Whereas women wanting a 6 footer, whereas men want a woman with Barbie sized features, and it's then neither are necessarily realistic or actually mirroring what the ancestral environment was.
Yeah, I really like the phrase naturalistic fallacy. I didn't know that word, but that did kind of pop up a lot in how we think about these things. Because it could step you in directions that don't really provide like, the extreme of this is what we saw in 1940s Germany, right? And that's
Mhm.
not the
Nope.
direction that you want to go. And I think that was like for some time the whole field faced a lot of pushback in multiple directions, and that was one of them.
Yep. Oh, yeah, yeah, it's actually kind of astounding just in the '60s and '70s, just a number of bad faith interpretations there were of the field, I mean, going back to the idea of just, saying that, well, Richard Dawkins was dangerous in the '70s because he was talking about, just the importance of genes and these things, trying to label E.O. Wilson as some kind of, Nazi eugenicist, other people I know personally where the label of a Nazi is or eugenicist is absolutely ridiculous, where just like Stephen Gould tried to mischaracterize the field as eugenics for a while, and just basically just imposing this mentality on us that is just completely non-existent. So there's almost like this projection of the naturalistic fallacy onto us, to where they assume that we take this all super literally. I mean, just I do a comedy after I talk about evolutionary psychology, where the whole thing is just a satire of people who take science too literally, and people in the world of certain pockets of science, they would impose these viewpoints on us. I mean, we used to be called sociobiology, but that name became so radioactive that we had to pivot in the '80s to evolutionary psychology, and I'm glad we did because it's been I personally I think that evolutionary psychology is a probably a better name for what we do anyway, but also too just I just uh, I try not to get angry about things, but I actually do get viscerally angry thinking about these people I know very well who are very kind people, very egalitarian people being labeled as hateful or endorsing something that they're not. So like just in the '70s and '80s, there were concerns like David Buss, Rita Cosmides, John Tooby, just all these, titans of our field who are also very nice people who, aren't leaning into this naturalistic fallacy, who will call it out when they see it. Just because they understand, the role of, of genes in the environment together, they were just a lot of people were wrongfully maligned, and because it was such a mainstream standpoint to say that genes and biology didn't matter with the mind, that evolution stopped at the neck. People were just kind of you reflexively and just with an eye toward in-group loyalty, just viewing my field as the bad guys.
Yeah. I think it takes a certain personality to step into that. Like, I was actually curious, when is evolutionary psychology introduced to undergrads these days?
It depends on who's teaching certain things. I teach. I immediately throw them into it. So my first chapter in Gen Psych, I talk about functionalism. So James and Darwin, and then after that, I then say, well, we're still talking about this today. Here's David Buss. Here's Todd Shackelford, and I just go over all those kinds of things. Other people, depending on their level of comfort, it varies. And this is not me knocking anyone at all. I mean, there are certain things that I don't cover that other people do. So I'm not a memory researcher. So aside from the outdated Atkinson-Schifrin model from 1968, I mean, I really should not be talking about memory with much authority. So it depends on the level of comfort for your Gen Psych instructor. And the thing is, there are a lot of students who may be misinformed on what EvPsych is. I'm still actually correcting a lot of, or not correcting, providing counter evidence toward people who may have gotten a bad perception from someone who told them what EP was, even though that's not what it is. uh, in social psych, you're probably more likely to see EP because attractiveness is a big thing. Again, it kind of depends on who's teaching the course. I teach it early. It's one of those cornerstone things I think is important. Not everything can be answered by an evolutionary question, so I try to make sure that they understand that there's a contrast saying this theory says this, these theories kind of run contra this. Sometimes this is right, sometimes this is right, and I try to make them think for themselves. I mean, evolutionary theory is not doctrine, it's not dogma in my classes. I cover it because there's pretty good evidence for it, but I then say, no, there are times when evolution's not going to drive certain things, and then, or if they disagree on something, I take that Principal Skinner mantra and say, "Prove me wrong, children," and I try to do that.
And this is like intro, like first year, like Psych 101 at
Yeah, yes,
Arkansas?
yes, yeah. It's like 101. I try to do EP pretty much immediately. Again, it varies from person to person. I would never malign anyone for not doing it. It's again, there's some things that I don't feel disciplined enough to cover, so I don't cover that in my class. And through no fault of anyone or the situation, they may not necessarily get to EP around the country, and that's okay. Most people teaching gen psych classes, they're overworked and underpaid. They're good scientists, and you have to teach what you know. Again, me teaching memory from a modern lens. I mean, I know enough about memory to cover it and understand how it works, but I would be remiss if I tried to cover it as some kind of expert. That'd be dangerous if I tried to do that. Actually, it'd be an absolute disaster. So a lot of times, courses aside from the basic things. So pretty much like most gen psych courses, you learn about how the brain works, like frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal. That's how I teach it. So yeah, those kinds of things. You have to go over Freud. There's certain things that are covered on certain levels. So that way you understand this is what the science is. Here's some outdated things, but still important to understand conceptually. But then you have a bit of freeform to cover other things, and I just go down the attraction route quite a bit. I cover, I mean, my gen psych course covers a lot of masculinity, femininity stuff in the face, just because that's what I know. It's expected for me to cover what I know. That I have that academic freedom. And University of Arkansas, a bit of a plug here, they're pretty good at letting us teach things however we want, provided of course there's evidence for it, which is just kind of this thing called a good education that higher ed kind of needs to do.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, that's the crux of tenure. It's like where you can be relieved of any pushback and say like, "Listen, I've got some crazy ideas. I'm gonna go wild with them. We'll see what happens." It's like Newton working on alchemy after he did F equals ma, where he's like,
Yep.
"Maybe we can
Yep.
create gold." And look, if he was right, we would be living in a different age.
Yeah, he still had that opportunity to do it though. Like kind of like how Daryl Bem has been trying to show that ESP is real for 30 years. The evidence is very much mixed on it, but then other meta analyses are saying, "Hey, wait a minute." Or like you'll hear like Michio Kaku is doing some stuff with extraterrestrials. I mean, things that are like big ideas, things that are that would take a long time to get published, and the tenure clock for a lot of people is ticking pretty immediately. So technically, I'm not on the tenure track, but also too, uh, just I have a certain degree of job security. I'm proud of myself, and even then, I'm still trying to tackle some pretty big questions now. I have the security now where I'm actually kind of going for the big things, not necessarily EP related per se. A lot of my EP research is very student friendly, where I'm trying to get them involved. And things like I'm so diplomatic with how I talk about things, I never have to worry about the outrage mob coming after me. Other things less so, but yeah, just I'm in a position where I can start asking these big questions without being worried about getting sanctioned.
Yeah, that's actually I actually have some questions on that. So, well, first of all, yeah, as I mentioned, like I think there's a certain personality that needs to be that you have to be able to get into this. Like you have to be willing to step into contradiction. You have to be willing to step into people will argue with you in bad faith. You have to be willing to step into something that can so easily be misinterpreted in like negative directions or interpreted in someone's individual gain. Like it could be pulled and manipulated in a way that's no longer scientific. And yet it is like it is a data driven science. It is a proper science. You can't publish in a respectable journal without having the data back it up. But
Yep, yep.
yeah, actually, you mentioned your students. I was curious about that because I looking at this from when you're 15 years old versus 25 versus 35 versus 45 versus 55, whether or not you have children, whether or not you live with your grandparents. I think all of that makes a pretty whether or not you've traveled the world. I think all of that makes a pretty big difference in this field in particular. I come from engineering. Things are engineering, are the hard sciences where the proof is in the pudding, so to speak. Whereas I think what y'all are doing is like it takes life experience to write something like Darwin wrote, even though he was like 25 or 26 or something.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, the hard part for us is we're measuring smoke. We are inferring the existence of a mental process through an indirect measure. So how do we know self-esteem exists? Well, we have what people circle on a piece of paper saying, one,
Mhm.
not at all, five, very much. So we already have that stacked against us. And sometimes actually, I mean, like again, we still do have observable things for our field. But yeah, a lot of ideas are very well, at least in psychology, I'm not sure if in the other sciences this is an issue for you guys. We have the phrase "research is me search," and oftentimes personal experiences will kind of inform what kinds of uh, research questions that we may try to ask. in my case here, as someone who's been interested in trying to get swole since he was a kid, trying I was going to be a pro wrestler at some point in my life, and during that time, try to get as beefy as possible. So it makes sense I'm studying formidability. Or the joke for my grandparents when I was talking about my mating research, they say, "Well, Mitch, you're trying to get a girlfriend? Shut up, grandma." But well, yeah, it's just a lot of times like these
Even
ideas,
if it takes a PhD, I'm gonna get a girl.
exactly.
Yeah.
Boy, howdy. It's that until I realized too that if you try to talk about good genes in a bar, unless it's the right person, uh, it's not going to go well. You may get on a list somewhere. I tell that to my students that way they don't try it. I tell them really quickly: do not ask a woman if she's ovulating. For the love of God, I cannot stress that enough.
I feel like they've seen, like, Good Will Hunting or something, and they saw that bar scene, and then they're taking evolutionary psychology, and they're like, "Oh, I'll just put, 1 and 1 together.
Yep. Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
I'll
Don't
clean
do it
up at
that
the
way.
bar." Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Matt Damon is charming. You're not. So that's why not you. You're lovely, Hugh. But yeah, I try to tell them. Yeah, yeah. You're not as charismatic as you think you are. But yeah. So in terms of like the whole me search thing. Yeah, just a lot of times our ideas are shaped by what our experiences are, and we'll kind of cover these topics. So, like as an example, I know a lot of minority individuals in the U.S. who study racism. I know people who are of a sexual minority status; those try to study issues in relation to their identity, and that's fantastic. And the thing is actually, now I've had some of these ideas myself being outside of certain developmental windows. So studying mate preferences in my early 20s was, pretty easy because I had a million ideas because I was trying to apply to theories, as the kids would say. But just I also noticed too, actually, just as I'm in my 30s now, I some of my ideas are kind of pivoting based on certain developmental stages. I also know too that there's some evidence suggesting that when one reaches parenthood, they will actually have different ways of approaching, environments. So there's some great work actually, as example from Barnaby Dixon, showing that when women are pregnant versus when they have a child versus when there's no expectation, they don't have a child at all. The way they view facial features actually will vary based on, well, what could the social target, maybe a bearded man, how could they how could they increase or decrease my inclusive fitness? Or as an example, some great work by Nick Carey and colleagues, looking at when people become parents, do they become more vigilant of threats? They do actually, and we actually see a greater adoption of social conservatism when you have a child, because the idea here is you want a society that could ostensibly protect your investment, and and in some instances endorsement of family values could be a way to make sure that your kid can, survive into adulthood and reproduce themselves. So there are all these like Mises stories that kind of come together that create a tapestry of what behavioral sciences are in, and it just kind of depends on what is the makeup of the science, which is also too, frankly, why I'm such an advocate for viewpoint diversity. Just because, I mean, if we all think the same way in a field here, there's not necessarily to push back to ideas that could be quixotic or maybe going off a cliff. So, on an ideological standpoint, are we so homogeneous that we're failing to notice the truth? Also, too, maybe there's some perspectives where you're just not getting things because you may not necessarily have certain experiences that could inform things that could create testable, objective, interpretable predictions. I mean, like this is me. I'm not saying that science is not objective. People try to say that all the time. I find that absolutely silly. But at the same time, though, we still have to recognize that maybe your perspective can help you see other angles that can actually lead to better science that could essentially be more objective.
Yeah, I'll bring this to an engineering example where the wing was studied by academics in labs, and they were doing a lot of insanely cool mathematics. They're doing like experiments, and they're coming up with all these theories of flight. But they pretty much hit a roadblock when it comes to actual practical to taking off, right, so to speak. And it was the Wright brothers who were not academics. They were just practitioners. They were like folks in their backyard saying, "We're going to get this thing figured out," and they were building
Mhm.
prototypes. That did not come. I mean, I went through academia. I have a ton of respect for it. But this is an example where, like, just having a different way of approaching the same problem in a hard in something that's like that's driven by engineering, we see it there as well. So like, I'm I'm 100% in favor in that. But and there's also this issue where if any viewpoint becomes like sort of the default narrative that people accept without question, we're in risk of failing to discover new ideas, right? So, like you mentioned, a person studying ESP, I didn't know that was a thing. I'm happy to hear that. Like, I recently listened to the telepathy tapes. I was talking to my brother, and I was saying like it's. I have a lot of questions about it, but what I would really like to see is a data-driven scientific approach to understand these things. And we were both a little bit like saddened that it doesn't seem like there's much research into it, which would help answer some questions. So I'm happy to hear like someone is looking at ESP and other phenomena like this.
Yeah, yeah,
Whether or not it'll prove fruitful. I'll put it
yeah.
like this: a null hypothesis is just as value as a proven hypothesis.
Exactly. I tell my students all the time, a null doesn't mean failure. It just means that we have to look in other directions, and this is still something useful. I publish everything. I tell my students all the time, we're going to publish a p-value point 0.9 if necessary, because that's going to inform science. Yeah,
That's
just
I'm happy you do that because that was actually, is one of the things that frustrated. There's a number of reasons I didn't go to academia, and to be upfront and honest about it, I don't have the creativity. Like I would not have made it. I would not. I don't. Whatever I have in me, an academic like research is not one of them. Teaching is, solving problems is, explaining is, but the actual creativity that you need to like drive new ideas and to push those through, that's a whole different ball game. Um, but one of the things that it frustrate me is like, you'll try a lot of different things, but and a lot of things won't stick. But
Mhm.
those are a lot harder to get published. So it's a lot harder to say that A does not prove B, but it's a lot easier to say B does prove C. And so that's like I feel like honestly, as I went to conferences and I spoke to other people in my field at the time, we would kind of share that we discovered the same null hypothesis. And I was like, man, you could have saved me like 8 months of research if you had published that. But then
Yeah,
who's going to publish it? We didn't publish. We would
yeah,
have published those kind of things.
yeah. Well, that's where journals need to put their money where their mouth is. So psychology has been pretty good about this. So the ESP stuff that kind of kickstarted a bit of a renaissance with methods and rigor for our field. So unfortunately, like a lot of the original ESP data, they appear to be, just kind of like the product of. Now I'm using this in a way that I'm hoping doesn't sound libelous. Maybe these results could have been, part of, old school ways of analyzing data to try to confirm predictions, even though that's not necessarily so-called best practices anymore. So people can't replicate these findings. People have tried to do the simplest experiment possible, same basic stats. No one can find this except for this original person. There was always this question of, well, were they doing, possibly things to make their data look good, not necessarily faking things. No one was faking anything, but were they doing things potentially behind the scenes that you would have historically not reported? So psychology tried, well, we call this the replication crisis, and then born out of that, we have the open science movement, where now you're trying to put all your methods out in the ether. You're trying to show everyone every single step of the way possible. You're explaining all your exclusion criteria, all your codes out there, so people can follow this. And psychology's been pretty good actually about kind of putting the null hypotheses in the literature. It's actually much easier now to get a null finding published, especially if it meant uh, challenging an orthodox idea. So there are a lot of null findings that are challenging things. Funnily enough, though, we did a bit of an overcorrection. Though the pendulum kind of swung the other way to where if you replicate an original finding, it's harder to get that published than a failure to replicate now. And sometimes a lot of these bigger ideas, there is kind of pushback on them just because there are other studies where they say, "Well, I didn't find evidence for this anyway." So there's almost like an overcorrective conservatism for a lot for some ideas now, which can be great, but also too, as we reap the benefits of potentially more trustworthy findings, more receptivity to null hypotheses, are we incurring other kinds of costs the other way? So, uh, we're more likely we're addressing type one errors pretty well, but are we actually addressing type two errors, the false negative? And how do we make sure that our science can be as balanced as possible? And I worry that we are creating a scenario where we've accidentally swung the other way.
Hmm. Yeah, it's funny how these things come in swings. You end up on one side of the pendulum, then yeah, the overcorrection, the overshoot.
Um, Nuance is dead.
Sorry? Oh, Nuance is
Nuance
dead,
is
yeah.
dead. Yeah.
That it is. Hopefully we'll swing in a direction to bring that back. I wanna ask about moral outrage. And we were kinda dancing around this, where when we're talking about, like, narratives and things that stick and, like, pushing back against an idea. And, you know, if I understood what you were writing before, you were associating the illustration of moral outrage in a way that is meant to virtue signal.
Mhm.
Is this mate selection? Is this like group, I don't know, group selection kind of thing, or like mimetic kin selection? Is that the idea that you're pushing here?
So the idea of moral outrage, there's a big idea about just like moral signaling about 10 years ago. A lot of these ideas were born out of research saying what when we're making a moral decision, the degree to which this is calculated may signal certain things. And on a broad social level, maybe identifying good group members more generally. If someone's more reflexive in their decision making on a moral issue, that could indicate they're likely uh, more trustworthy because reflexively they're making the pro-social decision versus someone who's much more calculated. The difference between deontology versus utilitarianism. So those are some of my more original ideas. And it just to start out as like broad sociality, but also too, what can we infer downstream from this social interaction on a general lens? What does this look like in a mating domain? So if someone is espousing a more emotionally reflexive response toward a social issue, are we actually saying to ourselves, this person may engage in relationship scripts much more readily? So are they going to follow conventions for relationships as if this were a standard social interaction? And what some of my work has shown is that much like how moral outrage or disdain toward people who may be rule breakers, that people are very public in saying I don't like that, this was bad, and I have to signal that this is bad, potentially in the service of ensuring people think that they're doing the right thing. Uh, the From a mating standpoint, we tend to view these people who get outraged as a certain kind of mating partner, a mating partner who is reflexively loyal in a pair bond, someone who is stereotyped as being, interested in short term versus long term mating, or I'm sorry, in long term mating specifically. So, if you're reflexive, maybe you'll be seen as more ready for monogamous pair bonding or serially monogamous in some instances. Are you less prone to infidelity? So some of my work shows actually that as we're identifying these people as pro-social, people whom we can trust more, what does this say about them as mates potentially? And in turn, then one possible reason as to why why moral outrage could have persisted, at least among people as something that's a valuable signal, is because we may view an outraged person as someone who's pro-social and thus able to contribute to the pair bond, and those children could survive into adulthood.
Yeah, that's when I was thinking about this, I hate to say it, but the first ideas that came to mind were like political divisiveness, because I think that's just that polarization has really grown in our everyday lives, where a lot of like menial tasks or ideas or thoughts can end up having a political slant to them. Whether or not that's true, there's a narrative that can be pushed in almost a ridiculous sense. Like I gave just an example to a friend where it's like, how do you take your coffee? And if you answer that in one way or another, it indicates your political leaning, and then that's like a whole different thing. And
Mhm.
for the record, I take my coffee black, so whatever that means. Um,
Well, it just means that you're a fan of the movie Airplane.
and that I am. That I am. Surely you're joking.
I'm not joking. Don't call me Shirley.
Oh man, what a classic. But yeah, I mean, a lot of these things with moral outrage, I could only like it's almost like some things have become a team sport. Is kind of how I see it. Is are you in this cause? Do you support the Dallas Cowboys? And it's like, well, those two, the inference from them is very similar. Where it's like, are you on the? It's like it doesn't even matter if you actually believe what you're sharing your moral outrage about. And I don't know how authentic that is, but it does kind of it does bother me if that's a part of human nature, and I could see that in terms of like a tribal nature. It does bother me a little bit because there's an authenticity that is kind of missing if you're just relaying the motos of your team. You know, like
It
I'll
makes
say go Falcons because I grew up in Georgia, but I haven't watched the game since they lost in, I think it was 2016 to the Patriots where they had they had the biggest win in Super Bowl history at halftime and then threw it away. So that's the end of my relationship with the Falcons, but I'll still root for them without watching a game, you know?
Oh, no, I understand that, yeah, so, as a social psychologist, I'm still, I recognize the just how minimal in groups can kind of emerge. As a sports fan myself, I'm from Cleveland, and, just, that I will always lament about the Browns, and, I will always hate the Steelers, it's like pathologically sometimes, it's,
You, you,
again,
you had a
I
tough
recognize.
upbringing. You had a tough upbringing from the outset, man. A Browns fan? Whew.
Yes. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's a lot of discipline from that. Oh, actually, it gets worse too. Is I'm also a fan of the Edmonton Oilers, and the past two, or actually now three Stanley Cup playoffs have been absolutely testing of my patience.
This is a villain origin story in the making right here, ladies and gentlemen. This is how villains are made. The disappointment of being brought up as a Browns and Oilers fan.
Oh my god, yeah, it's a, I it's built my character.
That it does. I say that about the Falcons all the time too. Mitch, one of the things that I wanted to get on about this with like the moral outrage I couldn't find much of stuff on what you do in this or exactly what your thoughts are, but you did mention it, which is you discuss academic or you have an interest in academic censorship and academic freedom, and I think you know to have insight into that over the last like 10 or 15 years, where it seems like there's a lot more hot button topics. And we have seen it's not common, fortunately, but we have seen people with tenure being relieved of their duties.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So people being relieved of their dues with tenure, yeah, or even also pre-tenure too. Just the idea is like there are a lot of people who try to push big ideas, and well, the thing is, in the end, you're still subject to the whims of the admin, the bean counters. Tenure as a platonic ideal, it should protect you, but if you piss off the right person, it's not going to protect you. I mean, whether it's whoever's in charge, it doesn't necessarily matter whether it's the one president or the other. There's always been this push against academic freedom, and basically, are the costs and risks just higher than the possible benefits of having this freedom? So there's always been this tension, and just and just for the longest time, it was just people were were just kind of uh, uh, able to push these ideas, but also too just in environments where outrage mobs do exist. People are so some people have historically lost their jobs depending on like who's in charge. So there was that one biologist at Harvard who was defending biological sex, where she was essentially canceled and fired even though she had tenure. You'll hear the occasional story where someone is relieved of their duties because they were talking about about racism in a way that appeal to the left. So left and right, no matter who they are, everyone's going to get censored. Basically, when you vote, you're just voting for the party to ban which books, certainly. Uh, so it happens all over the place. So just having this principled stance to let ideas just kind of sit there. Uh, Academia is not activism. You can be an activist and you can be a scholar. Mixing the two is oftentimes not necessarily a good idea, but at the same rate, though, there's always this pushback to say, who's going to do, who's, that's what I can describe it. So, uh, uh, there's always this sense of pushback in a way, yeah, that you have to be ready to defend your ideas, but also too, the when we try to meld activism and scholarship, we end up in a scenario where we're not doing either correctly, really, and people kind of end up in a position where just the scholarship can falter, the activism is kind of becomes unsustainable in some ways, and I think is what when sometimes people try to push scholarship into activism, that leads to issues where a lot of times we have scholars kind of not being able to say certain things, there's almost a degree of censorship. I've never personally experienced with censorship myself. Oftentimes, probably because I'm pretty good at maintaining an even keel. I try to be diplomatic. University of Arkansas has been pretty great for me so far in terms of letting me have this academic freedom. I mean, there are some stories out there of other places who aren't necessarily that great, but there's always this idea that that ideas should be shared and discussed, but then the whether that actually can happen in practice is another story. Again, I've never experienced this myself. I've never actually been censured for sharing honestly reported and objective ideas. Man, just I worry sometimes. I mean, this is again something that is bipartisan. You hear stories. Fire actually has a pretty good track record of figuring out like, is this right wing censorship? Is this left wing censorship? Is it somewhere in between? A lot of times, I mean, people in admin they are pretty risk averse, and some things like we none of us actually want censorship. None of us actually want the ideas to be censored broadly. Well, some people do, but also too, those people are very much a vocal minority in academia. But at the same time, though, there's such a risk aversion from possible activist backlash, possible, I mean, Twitter mobs. I'm not saying X, but it's at the same time, though. And are what is the pushback from people, and then basically, are we letting so even though the ivory tower metaphor is oftentimes used negatively to say that we're separating ourselves from another class, sometimes that ivory tower functions primarily as a way to make sure that people who don't know the topic are not trying to influence things as experts. I mean, obviously, experts should have buy-in from the public, and we shouldn't lie to people. We shouldn't be doing things that actually impede public trust and science. I mean, we've been doing it for a long time, and people kind of got screwed in many ways by that. I mean, like I mean, we go back to the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, where people trusted scientists, and ended up with a lot of poor black sharecroppers dying from syphilis. So I mean, the ivory tower, I mean, it can foster distrust, but also too sometimes a mingling of some ideas with the experts can actually lead to people not having the full respect and discipline for what ideas are. So even if we're trying our best to respect things, how do we make sure that the outrage mob who may not be as in tune with things, how do we make sure that they're not, unintentionally, preventing us from having academic freedom that can ultimately answer your questions truthfully?
Yeah, I think about university as kind of like the battlefield of ideas. It's the
Mhm.
marketplace. It's a marketplace of ideas where every ideas get a chance to fend for their own, and the best ones are the ones that stick around, and they're the ones that make it, right. And I think this is the kind of place where the Overton window has to be quite broad
Mhm. Yep.
to allow all the ideas to compete. Because you don't, I mean, for the longest time the earth was flat, right, and the sun was revolving around the earth, and idea after idea gets chopped down,
Mhm.
or corrected after being the extreme version, right.
Yep. Oh, yeah, yeah. And
And
and then there's correction the other way. So, like, during, 2020, there was this desire to start, pushing these ideas about racism that were, very much, like, informed by one perspective that was not necessarily the most falsifiable, and, we ended up with, a lot of issues where research was not necessarily that great coming out of some of these camps here. So you're right, the Overton window is sometimes just not broad enough, and we end up in this scenario where just like we're not less letting ideas stand on their own. We have to push orthodoxies. I mean, going back to the idea of Galileo, when the Catholic Church was talking about Galileo, was talking about the geocentric model originally, they were canonizing Aristotle. Aristotle was the one who came up with this idea, but if you were to tell Aristotle that his idea would be canon, he would be appalled by it.
yeah, the Greeks had the Greeks were ahead of their time. They definitely pushed academia and philosophy in a direction that till this day we're still at our best we're Greek philosopher at our best. But yeah, I mean, I think it was a fire. I forgot exactly what it stands for, but it's I think Greg Lukianoff is the head of that now. And yeah, they had that book that came out, him and I think one of his students or something, called "The Canceling of the American Mind," and it kind of touches on these sort of cancellations. I mean, I think the most egregious deterrent is when when they're visiting professors who come to give a talk, and maybe their ideas are just not people don't really like them. They're not really accepted, but there's no reason to turn the mob on them. That's that's the worst of the worst. I think more commonly, and they mention this in the book, is self censorship. It's when you have ideas that you don't think will be accepted, and so you just hold them to yourselves. And now you've essentially withdrawn your competitor in the marketplace of ideas that may be
Mhm.
right, as outlandish as
Yeah,
they are, or if they're
yeah.
not right, they at least sharpen other swords, right? And like that's I think something that has to be accepted is in that kind of environment. The tricky thing is that you can have a bad idea led by a charismatic person. And so you can have a bad idea that is accepted due to persuasion rather than the idea of itself. And
Oh, well, and that oh, go ahead.
this is, I think, what makes a scientist in particular special and difficult to be one is that you have to be able to remain objective. So like you have to live in this balanced place where you're able to bring in a unique viewpoint, you're able to bring in creativity, you're able to drive the field, but at the same time, you're not so stuck in it that you can't take a step back and say like, "Oh, this is wrong or that's wrong." Like you have to be invested in it enough where you believe in your ideas, but you have to be detached enough where you're not going to push away truth for it or that you're going to be afraid of truth for it.
Absolutely, yeah. That's the big thing there. Yeah, you don't want to be afraid of the truth. And then there's also just the ideas like you don't necessarily uh, uh, there's always this fear that are people going to view you as as a bad faith actor, and if you don't necessarily conform to certain ideas, I mean, are there's a fear that are you going to be seen as just as hateful potentially? So just as an example, just I mean, there was a lot of again research done 5 6 years ago on the topic of racism, which I mean, no, we need to study racism. We need to find a way to stop it. We need to find a way to understand what are the origins of it. But at the same time, though, a lot of work that was largely being funded or pushed forward was just not necessarily fruitful in finding ways to attack it or to stop it. And just we were allocating so many funds to these ideas that were that were largely just an exercise in catharsis rather than what can we actually do to mitigate biases? How can we actually stop like these very real disparities that do exist between groups? I mean, there are some nefarious, albeit subconscious, beliefs about certain groups of people in the medical field, and how do we actually ensure that these groups of people get the care that they deserve when we're ultimately just using funds to you know, create these confirmatory echo chambers rather than actually, stopping real world problems.
Yeah. One thing that I really like to see when these ideas collide are debates. But the tricky
Mhm.
thing with debates is that they've got to be held constructively. Like, and
Yes.
the worst example of a debate is a presidential debate. That I
Oh
find
God.
absolutely zero value in. I think it's conducted extremely poorly. It's all just sound bites. It's like you have 60 seconds to create an argument. The whole thing is so ridiculous. It's really just a show. I mean, there was
It's an echo
wasn't it
chamber.
exactly. And didn't JFK win because he looked more handsome on television or stuff like that? And you're like,
Y- Well,
this is not
well,
helping the
well,
cause
well.
of.
The funny part about that too is like if you watch the debate on TV, Jack won, but if you listen on the radio, Dick won.
There you go. There you go. It's like, are you presidential debate for the cameras or for the radio? And I think soon enough, I wouldn't be surprised if it's all social media. Which, by the way, I think is hilarious because in House of Cards, like 10 years ago, they were already doing a social media thing, and like I think I think whatever we saw in 2024 is going to be a lot subjectively worse than 2028. But anyway, that's a whole different thing. I do find value in debates though, but it have to be well constructed, well organized, and done in good faith. And I have seen a few like there's two examples that come to mind of who I think have done it well. One of them is this organization called the Free Press. This is
Mhm.
Barry Weiss's outfit.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I think I don't think they do it as often, but they do maybe two or three a year. And I like the way they conduct it. It's very respectful of one another. They have a decent amount of time. It's still, I mean, it's funny because I think they do 2 hours, maybe an hour and a half. It still feels short. Um, but they do have, I think, 4 people is how they've been doing it. Um, and these are they have, like, different perspectives, different qualifiers, and they're coming at it in a way that I think is very conducive. Another one that I saw, I like the way Rogan does it, and there's one in particular that stands out. There was a Graham, I think Hancock is his name, Graham Hancock and Flint something, but this one was more on archaeology and history and ancient civilizations. But even then, it was just 2 people talking for 3 hours. Actually, I think they went 4 hours. And they were mostly respectful with one another. Clearly, they got passionate and heated. But that kind of debate I found to be extremely valuable, and it's something I would like to see more in in general. And I do think like a format for academia could be very useful for that. I mean, I guess here's the thing: you kind of see it at conferences, but those are you have to be in the conference. You have to like be in that field of research, and it's to be quite frank, it's inaccessible to someone who's not an
Yep.
academic.
Oh yeah, 100%. And that's where, like, when I was talking about the ivory tower, why this is sometimes a real challenge. I mean, I want everyone to be involved in the discussion if they can, but also too, people need to recognize what their own limitations are, so that way we don't end up becoming undisciplined. I involve students all the time in in what I do. I want them to, to be involved in this process, but even when I do involve them in this process, I recognize, I'm still largely the expert in how do we situate people. That's the real challenge. So again, I want to have debates that are accessible with everyone. I want people to be involved in the conversation, but how do we make sure that people can, be involved in a way that's appropriate for their level while still making them feel valuable?
That's is a question I have for you. As a how long have you been a professor now, or like how long have you had your own lab at least?
6 years.
6 years. Okay, that's a pretty good amount of time. Have you had a student defend?
Yeah, so I don't have graduate students at the moment, but I've had a lot of honor students, a lot of undergrads, very smart undergrads. I love these kids. Yeah, a lot of these undergrads, I've had. I've had a lot to defend. I've lost count, but yeah, a lot of them, yeah, they have these big ideas that we help whittle them down. They come to me and I say to them, "Don't drink the ocean. We're going to put this straw in a cup now, and we'll tackle one small idea that can have big implications." And for the most part, that I try to involve them as much as possible. I mean, and a lot of my students I've been able to get published actually just because they've been engaged, they've been part of the process, and now is the chance for me to keep them going.
I did notice in pretty much like all it looks like almost at least recently, most of your papers do have your students headlining them, which is great. I mean, especially as an undergrad, if they're able to get that like experience in, they figure out whether or not they actually want to do this long term. What is your process of mentoring students? Especially, I mean, you're working with younger ones as well. These are not like there's a difference between undergrad, grad, and postdoc.
Uh, so with undergrads, a lot of times is I try to be as inclusive as possible. If you want to do science, you should do science. Science knows no demographic information. I have a lot of first gen students in my lab who are just total rock stars. Just uh, and some who are not, who are a bit more prepared, and I can work with either. It's just a matter of like where you are and how can I, you know, understand your zone of proximal development. So that's kind of my big push there. And so I try to go about doing all of that. Namely, I bring them in the lab and I say to them, here's a set of ideas that I have already. Here are some projects I'm working on. Which one seems interesting to you? What do you want to do for a thesis? That's a fairly big idea. And for that really big idea, I then push them into this domain where I make them figure out what is a little thing you can tweak just a little bit on this idea that you can do to make an even bigger step for the future.
And what does the research project look like? Like in particular, what is the technicalities of research methods? And probably, I mean, the of all the steps that I'm inferring mentally, the hardest one would be data collection, but maybe
Yep.
that's not the case.
So data collection, it's always challenging. It depends on what you're doing. So with my students, we collect through the participant pool at U of A. We're pretty great about that. And we can collect data, with some alacrity to it. And in doing so, as we collect these data, we are in a situation where how does yeah, so as we're collecting these data, sometimes it could take a month, sometimes it could take a whole semester.
What's an
Uh,
example? What's an example of that process?
basically, in our case, you post a study online through our data our participant recruitment program, and people click the link and they do the study largely. I don't have a physical lab space, so a lot of my studies have been done online. Other times, I will have people go out into the field. So on our campus, they take a QR code and they have a bucket of candy and say, "Hey, want to participate in research? Cool. Scan the QR code. Take a bucket of candy. Or a piece of candy. Don't take a whole bucket. Candy's expensive, so I have them go about doing it that way. And as we collect these as they collect the data, just sometimes it takes a while. Sometimes they're pushing pretty pretty hard in the semester. But yeah, just sometimes it's a matter of just letting them click a button versus actually going out and doing things in public.
So I know one of the criticisms, and I think y'all face this mostly in psychology, sociology, those kind of fields, especially with surveys, is that you're over indexed on the acronym is weird. You're over indexed on weird, and for those who don't know, it's something along the lines of Western educated. It's some
Industrial rich
specific.
demographic. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, 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 yeah. Industrialized, rich and democratic. Yeah. So yeah, there's always that concern. The thing is, if someone wants to do something with a non-weird sample, let's collaborate. I am not opposed to doing things with a non-Western sample. I would love that actually. There's sometimes when I feel like the criticism of doing only weird is incredibly valid. Other times I feel like it's just kind of a way to show that, oh, look at me, I read this one paper in grad school. So it kind of varies from person to person as to just how important it is. Uh, and things like I recognize that as a limitation, and that but the problem is with a lot of data collection is, do we have resources to do certain things? And given just how hard it is getting resources, especially in the sciences, or human sciences, uh, we oftentimes don't necessarily have much of a choice in the matter, and we may have to get a bit creative with getting things. So I have collaborators in other countries who have been pretty great about collecting data in this broad, generalizable way. But I also recognize too that collecting data like this is just it's more of a luxury that a lot of smaller places don't necessarily have. And the thing is, I frequently have caveats in my papers, so some things are less universal or maybe more culturally nuanced than we expect. So research on the self, the difference between the individual self in the West versus the collective self in the East. What does that ultimately give? How does self-esteem manifest in different cultures? How does self-enhancement manifest in different cultures? And sometimes actually, we are in a scenario where yeah, what looks like self-esteem in the West will not pop up in the East at all just because there are different standards. So in the West, we want to talk about how great we are. We're gonna show ourselves as a unique individual. But in the East, squeaky wheel doesn't get the oil, squeaky wheel gets replaced. So there's more of an interest in trying to show that just how like everyone else you are. I'm normal. In the West, we say I'm unique. In the East, they say I'm normal. That manifests in different ways of showing how you can make yourself feel good, and that leads to east west differences in self esteem.
Even weird in a college student out here in the US versus a college student in Central Europe versus a college student in the middle of China or Japan or Russia. um that same survey may or may not indicate a universality, and I
Hmm.
do think that like that's a good way to close the gap. And some other it really depends on the question that you're asking, but some of those questions can be answered through alternative data collection, where like census data, for example, where there's millions of data points, but the question is just what are you, what are you getting at, like what are you pulling up, and we discussed a little bit earlier about socioeconomics having an effect on what on mate preferences, which is an interesting one. Like to kind of tease through that. That's a fascinating one for sure. If you were able to, if you had no constraints, if you had all the time and money to take your lab, to do your next project, to dive into something, what do you think you would want to research?
I love and hate that question all at the same time. I
This
love the
is
big ideas.
this is NSF listening in. They're
Geez,
scourging the internet for to give away some billions of dollars.
for the love of God, please make it happen. Uh, yeah. So I'd say actually, I want to. I want to understand, just the body composition of authoritarianism. So I do a lot of work on formidability. There's some work suggesting that physical strength is diagnostic of a lot of attitudes and beliefs of people, primarily men. Uh, and I want to understand. And there's been quite a bit of work showing that physically strong men adopt more conservative, social values and all that kind of stuff. Women do to some extent too. Kind of depends on where you are in the country, how you model it. But I want to see is are there certain bodily compositions of those who may adopt an interpersonal style that can uh, 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 be more authoritarian. So just as an example, uh, how does a lack of social capital lead to endorsement of what's known as left wing authoritarianism, whereas would the presence of social capital in some instances lead to an endorsement maybe of right wing authoritarianism? So kind of two sides of the same coin. The idea being, do you want society to uh, adhere radically to your specific worldview? So, if you can engage in social conflict, will you want to have a societal structure that favors competition? That could be, you know, uh, adherence to the tradition, or if you don't have social capital, so someone who's less able to compete in these markets, what are the bodily features, what are the facial features that are most conducive to making a social structure that can aggressively make things as level playing field as possible, uh, maybe akin to like certain communist ideals. So, how do authoritarians what is the body type of an authoritarian, and what features are potentially diagnostic in that, and what kinds of ways do they navigate the world? And largely, I'd like to think about that from the standpoint of maybe upper body strength, certain bodily dimensions, facial scans could be a possibility. I know this is a radical idea. This is an idea for why tenure exists in the first place. But no, that's something that I've been mulling over for years now.
That's that's a fascinating one. And actually, I did want to ask a little bit earlier about this because this idea that once you start hitting the gym, so correct me if I'm wrong. Did you say that upper body strength is correlated with authoritarianism or with conservatism?
Just with conservatism thus far. So there's
Conservatism. Yeah. So
yeah, so like
go ahead.
go ahead, sorry. Oh yeah, just so basically like physically stronger men, they tend to be more opposed to wealth redistribution. They tend to have more interest in aggressive military actions. They're more likely to favor social hierarchies. So that's kind of there's a lot of work on that, like a lot of data on that point. But also too, I want to see like I mean, what just as like broadly speaking, like is a fascist or a communist, do they have a specific typical body structure? So, I mean, there's like, so one could possibly argue that social hierarchies could be part of a more freedom competition based structure, maybe we could call market libertarianism. But what about individuals who are physically strong or possibly physically weak? How does that lead to them want control? So maybe fascism or communism or any kinds of like wonderful authoritarian belief system. Maybe there's some kind of bodily composition based around that.
Yeah, this is hilarious because this is a very much a live meme on the internet, on Twitter, on X, whatever you want to call it. This is one of those things that it's almost a joke. I don't know, like I'm not really sure how I was born and bred, but there was like the some hypothesis I've seen, and I don't know if this is real science or pseudoscience, to be honest, which is that the physicality and the psychology kind of feed into each other, which is to say, if you're physically weak, then the idea is that you want protection and you're not interested in fending for yourself. You're interested in that threat just not coming into your vicinity. And so mentally and psychologically, the idea is that you're more willing to support the suppression of speech than the freedom of speech. So you're not defending your ideas; you're just having them blocked out of your vicinity, and they're not implemented.
Yeah, yes, so certainly a meme at this point. I want to see is there veracity to that claim. So the idea being, are you willing to defend, or do you want to have some kind of protection from certain things? And this is neither good nor bad. This research I'm talking about is not necessarily trying to say that any party is better than the other. I'm not trying to own the libs. I'm not trying to say that conservatives rely on these peripheral cues. Every party has their own brand of suck, and I'm kind of highlighting what are the costs of certain things. But yeah, no, the way you phrase that actually, that's kind of that's an elegant way of putting it. Actually, I am actually pretty interested in the idea being that if you is there some kind of embodied capital to where, like, do you feel like you could defend things yourself, or that just could somebody else do these things? And actually, one thing I'm looking at this fall now is considering how does how do these cues to formidability or maybe self perceived formidability, how much of this actually may be associated with a desire for censorship? So maybe left and right wing authoritarians, maybe they all want censorship, but maybe it just kind of manifests in different ways in how they would want the government to handle certain things if they want the government to be in control of it.
Yeah, this reminds me of kind of an anecdote where I was in Boston for like 9 years, and Boston is I was in Cambridge across the river, and that is a very it's a very liberal area. I mean, I think it went 90% Clinton in 2016. So you're pretty much surrounded by sort of a lot of people hold the same viewpoint. And I started training jujitsu there. I started training there. This was not too much before 2020 COVID happened, and I would say I leaned left. But then two things happened at the same time. One is I started training jujitsu, and there's a lot more conservatives in jujitsu. And then the other thing is COVID hit, and so both of those pushed me more to the right from the left. And I'm not gonna get into all that, but I did, and then I got to lifting and all that. But I did see, like, in my own evolution, it's like, oh yeah, the more physically I got fit, correlated with some different perspectives in economics.
Yeah,
But there's like, so in my personal case, there's a lot of different factors coming into place. Like different job, different stage in my life, going through COVID and the lockdowns and all that. So it's like, for me to put my own perspective onto it, it's I can't draw that direct line, but I do think it's interesting that the at least the meme and this is, as far as I know, there's no validation to this, but as far as the meme goes, um, getting physically fit, mentally shapes you in a direction. So then this kind of begs the question, which is nature and nurture. Is it like is there a genetic response to saying, hey, I'm more physically fit, therefore I'd rather handle threats on my own, and then this kind of feeds into a whole different set
yeah.
of ideas.
No, no, no. So I like the way you mentioned that. So I think it's a lot of like potentiation. It's basically humans are potentiated to be able to recognize these things, and they can calibrate their interpersonal style based on their self perceived ability to interface with threats. So I think no, oftentimes, I mean, you may favor social structures that would afford you the chance to handle threats by yourself. Now, this isn't saying that conservatism evolved. In the end, these labels are still very modern day. So the left right dichotomy. This is very much like a '50s thing that's kind of being imposed into a modern sense. But oftentimes, we what we would recognize as wanting a social structure that favors self determination, a degree of autonomy, uh, at least in a modern lens of conservatism, or at least maybe more like a libertarian sense of it. I would argue that uh, there is a genetic component to it, but also to the idea here is how we label it is still mimetic in the idea of like what do these labels kind of like indicate to us linguistically, and we're potentially to say I want to be able to do these things. Maybe certain coalitional structures will afford me that chance.
Mm. Cool, man. Hey, Mitch, how are you doing on time?
I'm doing just fine, actually. Yeah, I'm. It's 10:54. I'm actually feeling great right now.
Great. Well, listen, I gotta use the bathroom real quick, but I'm happy to keep going. Right, we were getting into body composition, and I have to ask what your workout routine is.
So, so right now I've just been going through, just some professional upheaval. So my workout routine has been, not necessarily the best at the moment. But when I'm actually firing on all cylinders, largely kettlebells. So a lot of times, it's just I'll have a leg day that's based primarily around a lot of like snatches and power cleans. Arm day. It's I do arm and shoulders pretty much the same day. So just various kinds of presses, alternating grips. I've not bench pressed in a while. I used to be a very good bench presser, just but also to the ephemeral nature of graduate training and not having a house yet. That's kind of put a damper on having a good bench in place. chest day for me is a lot of chest flies, also with kettlebells, and that. And I also pair that up with triceps, so a lot of skull crushers, just alternating grips. I can do a lot of the heavy weights, but I don't necessarily try to do the heavy weights all the time. A lot of it is just basically just alternating grips with low weights, where I can just do a lot of just like that negative resistance. That way, I can get the right kind of cut. Just a lot of upside down push ups, a lot of lunges up, just alternating through certain days. Yeah, just when I had time, I was I'd be I'd be a fairly prolific backyard wrestler, so that was damn good cardio.
I the worst shape I've been in my life has actually been through grad school. I remember qualifying exams, like those 2 years. The way my school was set up was when you go in, it takes about 2 years to complete your masters. Um And if you want a PhD, you go through the master's degree. So to get a PhD, you have to have a master's as part of it. Like you can't just go into the other. So along the way, you take your courses to complete your master's, and then you have to do a qualifying exam. And I think it's pretty universal. And those 2 years, I don't know, I was just absolutely freaked out. I think the stories after stories of like, only something like 60% of people pass qualifying exams on the first round. And I don't know if it's just some sort of humiliation ritual, which is what I now believe. But at the time, I was like, this is it. This is my life for the next 2 years. So I had put on a lot of body weight. But well, actually, the first question I had was when you do your chest flies, how do you do that with a kettlebell? You lie down on a bench and do it?
Yeah. Lie
Okay,
on
yeah,
the bench,
yeah.
feet flat on the floor. Oftentimes I can use lighter ones, and then just kind of dangle them on the forearms, and then just fly up.
All right. Well, I'm happy to hear that you're not skipping leg day. I got a lot of work to do on my own squats. But I've okay. So I think in one of your research projects, you mentioned neck muscles.
Yep.
And you do have a formidable neck, sir. Your
You
neck is quite
you
visually.
are you're flattering me.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I was thinking like I had never thought about research on it, right? But I was thinking about like the Mike Tyson neck, where he
Yep.
trained his neck to prevent knockouts.
Yep.
Where it's like,
My brain's
you're
not gonna rattle from this exercise.
absolutely, absolutely. So I couldn't help but notice that some of your research was related to the validation of the effort done on that. You
Yep.
said you grappled and you wrestled. I know, like having a strong neck is such a massive thing in combat
Mhm,
sports. I
mhm.
never trained my neck, but when I was grappling like every week, I would end up with at least one neck thing where I can't even turn my neck in one direction or the other. It's
Uh,
like it's that thing where someone calls your name and a normal person just looks to their left, but when you hurt your neck, your whole body like
yep.
moves that way,
Yep, dude.
or you look from the
Dude.
side of your your eyes.
Yep. Been there, bought that T-shirt several times. Yes. Sounds like you had a pinched nerve there. But yeah, it's yeah. Yeah. A lot of bridging, a lot of just trying to helicopter myself around on a mat with that. Oh yeah, yeah. It's yeah. Neck tweaks are never fun. Yeah. And just a lot of my neck research. Well, funny story. The reason why I got into neck research more specifically, it was uh through random chance at an HBES conference, Human Behavior and Evolution Society. There's a great presentation from Neil Catan from Australia. He's talking about neck muscles, great research, basically showing that success in fighting actually does correspond with having a larger neck. There's some research showing that individuals with larger necks, they tend to incur fewer injuries when they have a larger neck. Basically, it's a way to prevent your brain from rattling in the most like broad, morbid sense possible. So it stabilizes everything. So you're less likely to get a concussion with a thicker neck. Granted, there may be a bit of a trade off too, because maybe you're a bit more prone to sleep apnea because of all the things kind of constricting there. My mom does say I'm a snorer. So, but yeah, so the idea here is, yeah, your neck is a certain size, and it does correlate with fighting ability. It correlates with an ability to resist certain things. And Neil's research showed actually that we infer a lot from people based on their neck, and the neck, at least with my research, shows that there are signal values in your neck, particularly to certain muscles, that actually are predictive of things above and beyond, just your body or your face. So your face is very immediate, but maybe it's not as accurate. Whereas your body it's more accurate, but it could take a while to get there. And for a bit of a visual aid here, your neck muscles may bridge that gap. I do that one in my class, and the students lose their mind. I love it.
How many
But
how many how many of them have wrestled before? Have wrestled.
Wrastle, so thing is that U of A is an SEC school, so we don't have any wrestling here. And wrestling really isn't that big in Arkansas. I mean, like go to Oklahoma, everyone wrestles, but yeah, uh, not a lot of wrestlers. A handful of them who did all right. A couple people who did the pro stuff. So I mean, I have people who get it. I just well, basically, I feel like there's a cultural understanding. It's mimetic of understanding what the German suplex is. So I feel like everyone can infer what that ultimately is. Whether it's watching Kurt Angle go nuts, or if you played a game of Street Fighter, I feel like there's a bit of a culture script on that.
Yeah, that's awesome. I've seen in an MMA match, some crazy suplexes pulled off.
Oh
Like,
yeah.
there's this one amazing one. I don't know if you watch it all, but this is a few years ago. Demetrius Johnson, who like a lot of people call him one of the best, and may
Yep.
very well maybe. He was fighting, I think, Ray Borg at the time, and Ray Borg. I mean, Demetrius Johnson was just so far ahead of the competition. Ray Borg was a good fighter. He's one of the best. But Demetrius Johnson was just at a different level, and he finished it with a suplex, but in the middle of the suplex, he transitioned into an armbar.
Yep.
Yeah. And I mean, even saying it is just so ridiculous. You're just like,
Yeah.
who comes up with this kind of stuff? Like that's a
That is somebody who
highlight
watched a
reel.
lot of he watched a lot of pro wrestling growing up. That's all I'm thinking.
Well, I love the relationship between all these combat sports. So I wrestled a little bit in high school. I loved it. I did try kickboxing. I think I did for almost a year, but once you get kicked in the face, or
Hmm.
I could take a jab. I was like, I took a jab, and you're like, this has it's a life defining moment when you get jabbed in the face, because you're just like, oh, this is the real world, because a
Yep.
jab it doesn't knock you out. It's just like, pff, okay, that really sucked, but you know 5 seconds later you completely forget about it, and that sticks with you because you're like that it psychologically it's a lot worse than physically, but it does like change your perspective on things. But then when you get like kicked in the head, and you wake up with a headache the next day, you're like, that this is a different kind of sport. It's not grappling.
Yep. Oh yeah, yeah. Yeah. That's one of those things too. We're just so even though I try not to skip leg day, I've never been much of a kicker, and yeah, so kickboxing is something that's always eluded me well. So I was actually born with a club foot, so basically anything on my right side was just kind of lopsided. So the idea of footwork and leg stuff has just never been something that I've actually physically been able to do as well. I mean, other ways the club foot doesn't affect me, but it's just enough to where kicking is one of those things where I just didn't necessarily want to give it a try. And just like I think in terms of like punching more broadly, and grappling was just easier for me, so I just never really learned how to punch with the competitiveness that would be needed for a lot of MMA.
Yeah, kicking is a weird thing because like I can do a right kick okay, but my left is so weird and awkward, and it's like a lot of your body has to be coordinated. I mean, to throw a proper punch, that's a lot of coordination, but it's easier to fake a good punch than it is to fake a good kick. Because
Yep.
if you do a bad kick, you fall on you fall on your ass, right? Like you
Exactly.
slip,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
end up, yeah. And even the pros do it often. You'll see pros that throw a kick and then they end up falling, and you're like, that's a professional, and
Yep.
it's a very powerful attack, but you know,
Human, all too human. Yeah. Well, even in the world of pro wrestling, it's easier to throw a fake punch than a fake kick. Unless you slap your leg for the kick, then it sounds totally real.
yeah. I haven't watched pro wrestling in a long time, but I was watching when Goldberg was still undefeated. And
Sure.
this was when WCW and I think WWF at the time is what they called
Mhm.
it. They were like
Yeah.
competing on Monday and Thursday night, and it was the whole thing. It was I got into it for, I think, for a year. I was like really following all these things, but it was also at this time where you choose one or the other.
Yep.
Very few people were watching both. Like they were competitive, and I was WCW, so I guess I was the Pepsi of the of the wrestling industry.
Yeah. Yeah. I was always I was in the middle, so I prefer WCW for the mid card, WWF for the main event. So WWF, yeah, Stone Cold, HBK, just great main event matches. But then for WCW, it was all the old guys who couldn't really move that great anymore. So I was always like, I was very much a fan of all the cruiserweights with WCW. So I would vacillate.
Did you say that you also you were a bit of a practitioner, a backyard wrestler? Like you and some friends just kind of set something
Yep.
up?
Oh yeah, 100%. Yeah, yeah. Just oh god, that was a while ago. But yes,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. There was a time I wore tights. I had a theme song, taped up my wrist, had a finisher. Yes, my friends and I. So it only stopped because I got into grad school because that's kind of the lay of the land. But yeah, I ended up doing backyard wrestling for years actually. Just these little cassettes that are somewhere in Northeast Ohio right now with all my antics. That just we'd have these 45-minute Broadway classics. I was the one kind of dictating the pace because I kind of had the best grasp on how to do a lot of things. But so we had these great matches. And just which I try to work on the psychology. It was a whole thing for years actually. Drove our parents crazy, but it's that was just my way of getting exercise.
Yeah, well, I would, I mean, the number of injuries that come out of this fake sport is insanely high. Like, it's funny, when I think about, these days when I think about, like, what is a risk associated with it, like, I think a lot about it in terms of gymnastics because I feel like a lot of it is risk-taking, um, uh, showmanship,
Yep.
and that's kind of what's coming across. Like, when we were kids, I think I was doing this more in middle school than anything was, we would take a couple of mattresses and put them in the living room floor, and then we would
Yep.
do our little, like, brawling there, and, we'd do the power bomb was
Yep.
awesome. My brother
Yep.
is bigger than I am, and
Yeah.
whenever he power bombed me, I was so happy. I was excited. I was like, power bomb, and it was
Yep.
I I don't think my parents knew the extent to which we were practicing this. I think we were a little bit like if they were around, us and a few friends, we would be a little lighter. But as soon as they step out the door, we're like, all right, bring
Yep.
down the people's elbow or whatever. And
Yep. Oh yeah.
I do remember like the last time I did this. Uh, we had a friend who didn't really wrestle with us. Um, well, I'll call it living room wrestling. This is not even backyard wrestling. This is living room wrestling. But we were at a friend's place who didn't living room wrestle, and so he was a little bit new to the mix, and I ended up breaking his wrist, and it's not even a fun way of breaking his wrist. It wasn't like a move. It was like he was on the wall, the ropes, so to speak. He was on the wall, and I think we were doing some fake tag team thing, and like I was in the middle, and then I just kind of got pushed. And I fell backwards on him, and he tried to hold me back, and I guess
Oh,
he held his hand like this, and
never put your
so
hand back.
yeah, and so it broke his wrist, and then he ended up going to a hospital that night, and we're explaining to his parents that we were just playing, and his dad had no idea that we were these kind of ruffians. So that was the end of my pro wrestling days. But then in high school, I did do like let's say Greco-Roman. I think I can't remember if it was Greco-Roman or freestyle. To be honest, I don't remember the difference.
It was probably American folk style. So typically freestyle is not necessarily done in high school. Like there are high schoolers who do it. That's more of an Olympic style, slightly different rules. I doubt it'd be Greco-Roman in high school because that's a very specific kind of thing. The Greco is basically you wrestle without grabbing the legs.
Okay, yeah. I was just shooting everything. So I was like I think I was at 120. And I was a skinny, not strong 120, maybe 115, but like I actually developed a pretty decent shot for my age at the time. But pretty much I had one thing and it worked well enough, which is I would shoot and then I would take them down to the side. It was like the most basic thing you learned, and I did decently well with that actually.
Don't reinvent the wheel. Sometimes just the fundamentals are oftentimes what wins a lot of things.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I want to ask, man, what is the physiology of a neck muscle? Because this is a weird thing where it's like okay, most muscles, let's say the bicep, there's one lever. You go. This is the only. It's not. It's unidirectional. It's the only thing it's doing. The
Mhm.
neck is wild. The neck is 360. You're going left. You're going right. You could get. You hurt it in all these directions. And there is one machine. I forgot what they call it, but it was something that popped up in jujitsu where there's one way to train your neck where like you put almost like a helmet thing on.
Yep.
There's a cable that goes off to the side. That cable is what causes the tension.
Yep.
And then you do it from all different directions where you're like moving
Yeah.
your head against that. But you have to, you can like turn your head and again it's 360. This is a crazy set of muscles.
Mhm. Yeah. It's yeah. So I don't necessarily know about like the deep physiology of neck musculature, but it's just such as you said, it's such a three-dimensional thing that it's sometimes just critical for a lot of fighting, and the signal value that you would get from a neck is going to be dramatically different than that of your upper body. Largely, I mean, you can think of the neck as a stabilizer. You can think of the neck as a fulcrum, as just a whole bunch of different things here.
Have you ever heard this I don't know what to call it. This anecdote. Let's call it an anecdote. Have you ever heard this anecdote that people involved in combat sports are some of the kindest people that you'll ever encounter? And I don't know if there's any data behind this, but I think it's just that counterintuitive example. And like the idea here is that if you're training for a combat sport, call it boxing, grappling, judo, whatever, something you realize is that you need to train with training partners. And so part of that means that you need to understand what the limits of your training partners are along with yourself because you're not trying to injure each other, not in
Yep.
training, and that's
Yeah.
different from competition. So you see these people who are extremely dangerous in hand-to-hand combat who are in good shape, but anecdotally you keep, like the nicest people you'll meet are in a deadly combat gym.
Yeah. Well, no, 100%. So, whether there is actual empirical evidence for that, that's another question. I've experienced a lot of very nice people in the world of combat sports for the reasons that you're describing. I mean, it's about trusting another person. That's why the best pro wrestlers don't hurt anyone. So,
Mhm.
why Bret Hart, for example, was just such a great pro wrestler was he never injured anyone. That he would very famously he would say, "Oh, it takes any idiot who can just pretend to hurt. You can hurt someone, and while they're just standing still, it takes a real artist to make it look like you're killing someone and not touching them at all." And that's kind of just this idea of being able to foster trust for what you're describing. Now, granted, I've seen some people in combat sports who are not like that, so it's certainly not a hard and fast rule. I mean, there are certainly the brand of pro wrestlers, just as an example, who think this is all real and they will hit someone as hard as they can while they're just standing still because there it's a static target. For legit combat sports, I mean, I've seen my fair share of people who aren't necessarily the nicest, but actually that is an interesting empirical question. I'm curious to see whether, like, at least on a main effect level, that we see this level of niceness or gentleness, or what are some possible moderating factors? So, is it combat sport plus something else? Yeah, he actually. I'm curious about this now. I kind of want to run the study,
Yeah, there's the research question that you can
right?
ask. Because I was just listening to I saw a clip of Triple H and he was talking about this. I think he was talking about with Kurt Angle where he did I think it's called a pedigree.
Yep,
You hold some, yeah. Um he was putting Kurt Angle through a pedigree on a table, but the table snapped before
yep,
they were prepared. And Kurt Angle, they found out afterwards that he had a concussion. But like, he was like, well, how do we continue? Ooh, this is one of the things, the show must go on. So the standard is they continue to show, but they're also like watching out for one another. So
yeah,
he was talking about how they try to coordinate through that to keep the show running, but to like take care
yep,
of his partner.
oh yeah,
And there was another one, I think, when Stone Cold he had a pretty bad, I think it was a spinal injury, and
yep,
yeah, and it was like,
yeah.
eh,
Yeah, SummerSlam '97. It was Owen Hart actually
hmm,
sat out rather than kneeling for the tombstone. Kind of it gave Stone Cold a bit of a stinger. So the match still had to finish. So basically, Stone Cold and Owen on the fly, they found a way to finish the match. Nowadays, you would just stop the match, especially with
hmm,
concussion protocol. I mean, what we know now, just so many of our childhood heroes have died from like head injuries that were things related to head injuries, like CTE. But yeah, there are ways you can try to stay in character to some degree that that you're trying to make sure that the show could ultimately continue. Old days, you would just continue through it. Concussions be damned, which again is a terrible idea with what we know about this now. But there's one famous example just beyond just Stone Cold. It was All Japan Pro Wrestling mid '90s. Vader versus Cowboy Stan Hansen, and Hansen hit Vader so hard in the face one time, it popped out his eyeball. Actually, yeah. So there's just look it up on YouTube. It's not safe for life, but basically Vader's got his eye bulging out. He had to pop it back into place, and he finished the match. He stayed in character, even though no, he was severely damaged. I mean, Hansen, it was pure accident, but just like you just stay in character.
It's funny. I was talking to someone years ago, and so like, I actually find it harder to watch pro wrestling than to watch MMA.
Oh
Uh,
yeah.
and because I find pro wrestling is just so, it's like when I see some of the stuff, I'm like, man, that's too much for me. MMA is like, they're, I keep, for whatever reason, internally when I watch an MMA fight and I see a knockout, it's like, oh, that sucks. But when I see something crazy even in pro wrestling, and even if it's a perfectly executed, like, uh, set of moves where everybody is safe, I'm still like, oh my god. I mean, I can't imagine myself being in that. I think that's the thing. Um, I can see myself getting head kicked and then, being all right. It's like I might suffer temporarily, but I'll be all right. But when I see some of the stuff they pull off in pro wrestling and it's like, they pull it off and everybody's okay, I'm still like, I put myself in those shoes and I'm thinking, that's a game changing attack over there,
Oh yeah, 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 100%.
That's
Well,
wild.
also, like statistically speaking, MMA is a fairly safe sport compared to other combat sports. Like, it's regulated. I mean, John McCain kind of went out of his way years ago to make human cockfighting, as he called it, into something much more commissioned. So MMA is actually much safer now. But then pro wrestling, just because it doesn't necessarily have the same athletic commission guidelines, because well, for years. To avoid paying taxes, promoters would say it's not a sport; it's sports entertainment. That's why Vince was so big on saying sports entertainment for so long. It's a way to avoid the taxes of being a sport, but also things don't get regulated. And much like with cheerleading, where cheerleaders get hurt all the time, a lot of pro wrestlers, were doing all these crazy things, and just I mean, when they pull it off safely, that's great. But also too, uh, the one thing that Jesse Ventura would always say to the young wrestlers: get ready to be in a lot of pain when you're in a older situation there. So just there, like this is just kind of a product of the fact that I mean you're trying to up the ante, which is like kind of why a lot of companies try to bring things back down to fundamentals, where all the crazy dives, as great as they are, you can't do it all the time because I mean, think about yourself in the future.
Mhm.
And you're just like, oh, at least with MMA. So yeah, what they're experiencing is brutal. They also have days off. They also have a commission to make things relatively safe. And pro wrestling, for the longest time, did not have those guardrails.
Yeah, I mean, with there's a few things in MMA that I think are interesting. So first of all, yeah, like an up and comer is maybe fighting 3, 4 times a year, and then when you're a champ, you have a little bit more luxury, but your training is also a little bit different. But there was a lot of talk. I remember with the knockdowns. So in boxing, when you get knocked down, that's the you're not allowed to continue fighting. Like
Mhm.
there's
Yeah.
that moment where you give the knockdown fighter a chance to get up, and I don't know if this is an official rule or if it's subjective, but I think it's like 3 knockdowns, and the referee will call it. And that okay. But with MMA, if you get knocked down, the fight continues. And I've actually seen a hypothesis that continuing the fight reduces concussions, and this is the reason. When a boxer gets knocked down, they're already wobbled, and so when they get back up, there's a higher chance that they're going to suffer another critical blow. And
Mhm.
so like they might that first knockdown might give them a slight concussion, but when they get back up and they take another shot, they end up suffering
Yeah.
a worse one.
Second
Um,
impact syndrome.
there you go. Yeah. Whereas with MMA, since the fight continues, that slight concussion might end up leading to a few more blows immediately after that are not as dangerous, and then that would end the fight in like a TKO or something like that. So that's it's a possibility of what's going on there. I mean, MMA also has a lot of other ways to like finish a fight, so that could be a part of it. But yeah, it is interesting that I think boxing gives you more concussions than MMA, even though MMA is more like open ended. And I believe still to this day the worst of all is football. And that comes a lot of torsional concussions. So rather than like a blunt blow to the head, it's like the face mask. And I think that the penalty for face mask has just been getting worse. Like
Yep. It should be.
The
Yep.
cost of that is higher and higher. Yeah, because it's
Yeah.
people realize like, oh, you know what, this motion where your head turns and then suddenly turns back causes your brain to like twist from its support because your brain is not held in by bones, right? Like our brains are just like connected by nerves and like this gooey stuff and like I don't think they're called tendons, but it's like it's mushy stuff. It's not any sort of frame that holds our brain in
Yeah.
place.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's what makes a concussion so onerous, and why the helmets aren't necessarily protecting things per se, because well, your brain is still moving and it's going to hit the inside of your skull. So that's really what a concussion is, and the idea, of, at least for some people, is like why a football concussion is so onerous and why the helmets aren't doing much is because I mean again everything's happening on the inside.
Yeah, I might be speaking out of my ass a little bit, but if we compare like rugby to football, I believe rugby has less concussions, even though their
Yeah,
headgear is significantly less. And
yeah,
I've I've seen clips of rugby. I really don't understand the sport, but it's a lot more like head-on attacks, and there's not really any breaks. So, well, and that might be a part of it. Like in American football, it's all sprints. You do a play. It's like a 7, 8, 10 second play, and then you take like a 30, 45 second break, and then you go back at it full speed. Whereas in rugby, it's kind of like soccer where you're just continuously going. So maybe that's part of it. Maybe you're just not full on high speed. I don't know what it is, but it is an interesting point of data.
oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So you can think about it along the lines of well, if you're not wearing a helmet, you have to worry about protecting yourself. If you are wearing a helmet and you feel like you're emboldened to do more things because they're saying, I'm going to protect myself, I'm going to pad myself. So you may see people lower their head more to to
Mm.
do certain things. So there you'll see these linebackers in the '90s and like mid aughts where well, spearing was a thing where they lower their head, smack into somebody else, and just the consequence would be damn well. The science was still so new at that point. I mean, we hadn't seen the specter of CTE just yet, where we had so many people drive the wrong way in traffic, kill someone, and just that. So we were just now starting to see that, and it just that people felt this emboldened that they're saying like, well, the helmet's going to protect us, but also too, the brain damage is on the inside of the skull. So really, what's happening here? And then just football, hockey, kind of the same thing, where we're now seeing these consequences of people thinking that the helmet is going to protect them entirely.
It that spear reminds me of that video game NFL Blitz,
Yep.
where they just wildly attacked one another. It was probably one of the funnest arcade games I've ever played.
God, yeah.
Yeah. It was yeah, actually there was a lot of wrestling in it, right? Like even after the play, you could like run up to the person on the floor and like, do like a people's elbow or something crazy and wild like that. It was a very fun video game. Uh, but yeah, I mean, see, I think CTE is kind of an interesting thing because it's one of those. I mean, we see this in everything where the feedback loop has a large delay. So it used to be the case in the NFL and pretty much all sports where you suffer injury, where when you get injured, you might step out for a little bit, but then you come right back in. After like 5 minutes, you're like you rested and you're back in it. Now there's like, especially with concussions, there's a whole protocol, as you said, like this concussion protocol. But even I mean, I don't know how well this is known, but even now, if an athlete gets injured, it's not uncommon for them to just take like some form of numbing agent and then to get right back in. So
Yep.
they could very well have a broken bone in their body, but they're going to continue the rest of that day playing.
Yeah. Yeah. That's an unfortunate thing. It's gotten better with that. I mean, there were well, hockey was kind of like a big thing with this, where like they would drug up players, so that way they can play through the pain or their concussions. So there's one player, Dirk Boogar, who was just notorious for just playing through things and just I think it was him who was basically received copious drugs despite all the injuries, and eventually it led to his death. I mean, and just and there were other players like that too, where just they would just be in the scenario where uh, they would keep playing through things, just that warrior culture mindset, which frankly was bullshit. That's again another naturalistic fallacy, and they end up in the scenario where they just make things worse for themselves, and just at least, again, another example with hockey here where you would have the enforcer. Your entire job was just to protect your forward. So just for Marty McSorley as an example, his entire job was to protect Wayne Gretzky and put himself in these dangerous situations where he would fight people who would go after him. And basically, what we're seeing now actually is the worst cases of CTE tend to be toward enforcers, like people where their entire job was just to fight. And there were players who just for the longest time where their entire existence was just I'm going to hit someone, I'm going to fight, and you could watch the slow decline because again, if they're always fighting, at least with a lot of concussions, you had some there. The odds of you getting a concussion after concussion after concussion that were like severe ones that weren't second impact syndrome, not necessarily as high in other sports, but for hockey, you're fighting every night. Eventually, we see a lot of like very real cognitive decline, sometimes late 20s, early 30s, and just there were a rash of suicides actually just because
Mm.
people's brains were just scrambled.
I wonder what gets altered about the brain that ends up in suicidal and even homicidal effects. Like what is if I hear brain damage and I hear something like, okay, now this person has brain damage, they're not thinking straight. Okay, that makes sense. But to unlock more of an aggressive and violent action, and I guess I think we've, as far as I know, I've only heard of this more in males, but part of that could just be that like those kind of sports tend to
Yep.
draw more men in them.
Yeah, more men, androgenic activity that potentially is more aggression. But really, what's going on here is just so the reason why there's more aggression, hostility, like poor self control for the men in these scenarios, again for male dominated sports who already again have this androgen that makes them likely more aggressive anyway. When you get hit in the head and where you see a lot of damage, it's primarily in your prefrontal cortex. Like just this general area right here. This is where I'm not a neuroscientist, but broadly speaking, because I've taught the class so many times, this is the area of the brain involved in self control, executive functioning, uh, like moral decision making. So basically, your ability to restrain yourself appears to have a strong association with this area. To where if you have damage to this part, that's where you lose your inhibitions.
So okay, there's this physiology from evolution that is believed where we have a physical layering of the brain, and like the stuff closest to the core, this is like the autonomous system. This is like our breathing, our heart pumping, all that kind of stuff. We have very little active control over it, and then as we kind of go further and further out, especially to the outside, I think that's what we call the neocortex, and that's sort of like the human mind, right? It's like the separation from the chimps and the apes to the humans. um, so if I'm hearing you correctly, could it be kind of like saying, at our core, we have these sort of instinctual actions that say maybe more aggressive. This would be like the ape like fighting, the more likely to throw caution to the wind. But then we have our neocortex that is protecting us against our own like reptilian selves, and that is just more likely to be damaged from physical blows. Is that a
Yeah,
fair?
yeah. I would caution against the idea of saying like certain special parts of the brain just because like every species kind of has like similar enough cortical areas to where like they make and just there is a degree of reasoning, but also too what separates humans from other species is our frontal lobe, our prefrontal cortex, much bigger, much more convoluted, and unfortunately, it's on the outside of things because evolutionarily speaking, is the most recent. So this is what's going to hit the skull, inside the skull, much more readily, actually. So that's where all that rattling comes to be. And so, like, why is it that we have this area of the brain so much, or this big area? Well, it's because we're a social species. And we evolved to live in groups. I mean, if you're familiar with Dunbar's number, we have a certain number of conspecifics who can live with us, where we can have optimal cooperation, communication, and to be able to do that, we need a large brain. We don't have giant claws. We don't have giant teeth. We're not as terrifyingly strong as a chimpanzee. So we need to have a big brain to help us, organize what we're doing here, and there's oftentimes this interface between our our ability to cooperate, think things through, and sometimes our amygdala, which is like the emotional portion. I don't want to say more emotional, but basically the region of the brain most associated with emotional responses. And how is it that maybe the amygdala can have too strong a response versus the brain, and what does that feedback look like?
Yeah, I've heard. So I think the estimate I've heard of that Dunbar number is something like 150, and the
Yeah,
idea,
150. Yeah,
yeah, and the idea there was okay, so let's say the human evolved. Let's say the modern human evolved to be what we are. I've heard estimates from I would say about 200,000 to a million years ago. So if you take a human from 2,000 years ago, you put him in a time machine, you bring him out to today, he's physiologically going to be extremely similar to a modern human being. But way back in that day, the hunter gatherer times, and the they're wandering in tribes together in with a lot of family and kind of like I think the idea at the time was you trade tribes more so for breeding. So like if you're a male, you might go to a different tribes, so you have a different female selection and vice versa. And this kind of has to do with like the whole kin selection thing and not being like it's caution again, or it's a defense mechanism against like incest, where you kind of mix up the groups, but otherwise your groups are mostly familial or closely familial. But then beyond that, and at that number, I think the Dunbar number, the idea there is that you can know everybody within your group to a reasonable degree. Like you're not strangers with anyone in there. And beyond that, you just need different ways of like organizing. And by the way, this is an interesting topic that kind of comes up in startups and corporations in terms of organization. This is like why your exec level and the whole IPO thing changes drastically once you go from 50 people to 200 to 2,000. Um, but there's a couple things on this. What are your thoughts on like an evolutionary mismatch between a Dunbar number of 150 versus living in a modern society where we're surrounded by strangers in cities? And I
we are
will,
not equipped for that. We
yeah.
are not equipped for that at all.
Are you? I can't remember the guy's first name. He's one of the Weinstein brothers. He's either Brett Weinstein or Eric Weinstein. One is a physicist. One is a I'll call him an anthropologist, but I'm
Yeah,
not exactly sure what
yeah.
his
I think
title
that was
is.
Brett.
Brett. Yeah, he wrote a book, and I really enjoyed it. It's called something like The Hunter Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century, and it was a lot about this like evolutionary mismatch. And it was kind of like to understand some of the ways that we think and act and respond to our environment around us.
Yeah, yeah. It's so yeah. Yeah, our ancestor brain is really not caught up with just a modern environment. It's it's the idea being that just there was just such a small passage of time of industrialization that is just so removed from the lower Pleistocene, that how do we actually engage that? And are we still operating in this world where, like, even though we want to bring ourselves closer to this Vulcan ideal, oh, wrong hand, there we go. Just trying to put ourselves in this world where we can act logically, but also too just, I mean, in the end, emotions and these kinds of like functional responses. I mean, there's a reason why we have them in the first place. And the thing is, like, can we even really live in this modern society completely divorced of how we evolved, even though we're trying to? And in a modern world, we're really not equipped to live in that large of a large of a scape of people.
Yeah, it is interesting, especially when you think about like these mega cities. Like in the US we've got New York, but then there's like some really crazy large cities out there in population, like London, Tokyo, Istanbul. And it's just I mean, it's the only world that I know, to be honest. And so like even considering what a life would be in a smaller community and like what my brain can properly capture, it's not very clear. And I think this also feeds into this whole issue where I think humans are drawn to echo chambers. Like I think we're like there's this tribalness to us that I would like to believe that humans are above tribal nature, but I I it's hard, man. It's hard. It's
Yep.
hard to break out of our tribes. It's hard to say like, "Hey, listen, um, I'm gonna root for my team, not because I'm programmed to since, I was a kid, because that's the team I grew up with, but no, because I objectively enjoy this team for whatever reason.
Mhm.
I like their
Yeah.
ideas, I like the way they play, and I mean, this feed by the way, I'm saying team, but like, if it's
Yep.
not clear, this feeds into religion, it feeds into politics, it feeds into
Yep.
scientific,
Yeah. Mhm.
ideology, all of that.
Well, there's some reason behind that too. This is less so classic of psych and more social psych. The idea being that we like to think about ourselves as pretty great. We all have main character syndrome. We all want to be the protagonist in our own life story, and we think that our ideas are pretty good. That we're special. I'm unique, just like everyone else. And thing is, if we find other people who are just like us, they must be pretty great too. So the echo chamber that turns into who can give us the most positive reinforcement. And if we think that we're better than average, if someone else thinks just like us, they're also better than average. And this likely makes us all start to like ourselves a lot more, and then that leads to in-group favoritism. And oftentimes, actually, oh, so there is certainly out-group derision. Racism still exists. Obviously, it sucks, but also too a lot of like group membership, as an example. Uh, it kind of turns into it's less so about you're favoring you're disfavoring other people, more like you're favoring your own side to try to bolster them up here. So I mean, it's like it's still biased and it's still terrible. It's just as it's more based around how do you make your side better.
Yeah, I mean, so this is such a great um perspective, which is to say, like, is it good or is it bad? Because at the very beginning, we talked, we discussed a little bit about this whole like moral outrage and virtue signaling. But look, if you're signaling, hey, listen, I'm a good mate because I believe in these ideologies, and one of those ideologies includes is averse to um extramarital relations or something like that. Like if that's part of the group that you're signaling, then it's not such a bad thing, right?
Yeah, no,
But
yeah. So I mean, people like to deride virtue signaling as just being this vacuous thing. Of like, sure, it can be like virtue signaling. I feel like in some ways, it's just a way to signal these banalities or insipid platitudes. But sometimes, like, I mean, I kind of do want to know, like, are you into long term committed relationships? I mean, even though like who's against crime, literally most people on the planet. So, but at the same time, though, if you're signaling, I don't like crime, that's kind of a useful signal. I hope it's honest. So like just sometimes like yeah, even though like virtue signaling can be kind of a banal thing. I mean, we all can think of celebrities who think that they're so brave for speaking out on something that everyone agrees with. But at the same time, though, it's still nice to know at least on some level that you're kind of agreeing with me on something that I may consider important.
yeah, I mean, I was thinking about like what is the hot topic today, and like one of those is data centers, right? And like there's one thing to say like, okay, get into the science and the effects and all that, and like that's the nuance that we talked about earlier, and like
Yep.
yeah, it's actually it's a local issue, in a sense that what would make sense in some rural area in California is actually going to be very different for something that's in the city center of New York City. And those are complete, like if you say I'm against data centers, it can be in one scenario but not the other, and that's a
Yep.
sensible position. But if you're like flat out against it, that's actually more of a signal that says, oh, I'm on a particular team.
Yep. Yeah, and yeah, just to me, as someone who tries to value trade-offs and like recognize what a certain policy can do, that's what it drives me a little crazy. I mean, broadly speaking, like don't put your data centers next to a zoo. Whatever Nashville is doing right now, I think it's Nashville, where they put a data center next to their zoo. Why? But yeah, that's one of those things though, where just that's why I try really hard not to speak out specifically on broad complex issues with slogans. Like I try really hard to avoid sloganism or to make a very blanket stance on a lot of things because I recognize that once you take these stances, you may have to follow things to the end where there are certain trade-offs that a specific platitude may not be able to capture, and that's why I try to be incredibly careful when I speak about certain issues. And like sometimes people may think that I may be against certain things that they say. It, bums me out sometimes because I'm really trying hard to navigate certain things very carefully, but it's no, it's one of those things where I just don't want to position myself in a place where I have to write a check that my butt can't cash.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so hard to make general statements, right? There's a flexibility that you need, where a position might hold true under a certain set of qualifications, but be completely off in another set of perspectives, right? I don't know, like local governance laws again in a desert is going to be very different from a coastal area, right? Like if you're in a desert and you've got some set of irrigation laws to protect the water, or like the desalination process or whatever that you're working on, that needs to be accounted for.
Yeah.
But I think like there is a tribalness. That perhaps has roots in this in evolutionary psychology that we need to be aware of. One more thing that I think is really interesting is the entire field of economics was turned upside down in like the 60s and 70s because, as you said, there was this initial idea that humans are all rational beings, and then in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and especially now, like the whole field of behavioral economics said, hey, humans are weird. We're weird in the sense that we don't follow rational trade-offs. Like it's a lot more than just saying maximizing utility.
Yep. Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. That's one thing I like to remind my students all the time. Is just so I don't necessarily want to say that we're irrational. It's like so even though we're not necessarily following certain logical rules, so even though utilitarianism is mathematically like you're optimizing the most benefits for the highest number of people, great. But at the same time, though, mathematically, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're a trustworthy conspecific. So, if you pull the lever in the trolley problem, you may be optimizing the most number of people who are going to survive, but also too, you're showing that you can calculate your way through something, and that's going to make you look like a possible shitheel to other people. Because what if you're in the situation where you could be harmed? Someone could be ready to off you. You may view this person as exploitative or untrustworthy because they're calculating your own social value, and oftentimes with pulling the lever, it's a scary thing for people. People emotionally avoid pulling the lever. They emotionally try to avoid people who would pull the lever because we may view these people as possibly able to harm us, and that's functional. We evolved to live in groups. We evolved to be around people. We like warm, trustworthy individuals. So even though we're not following this mathematical logic, it's still functional as a way to make sure that our genes can stay afloat.
Yeah, what's interesting is like I think our legal system is I don't our legal system is interesting because and I don't mean just ours in our state or in our country, but human legal systems is partially it's a reflection of of what we value and how we value that. And then partially it's also like driving those values. And like in this trolley problem, for example, I don't think I would pull the lever. And the reason I wouldn't pull the lever is because if I do pull the lever, I know that there's going to be some legal responsibility that may possibly come my way of
Yep.
taking action. And so
Yep.
like I already know it doesn't matter what the numbers are. If I pull the lever and someone gets harmed, I know that there is the potential of a legal consequence that I would have to face if I were to touch it. Whereas if I stand there as a bystander, uh I'm off the hook. And like here's the crazy thing. Like I'm speculating a little bit, but if the option were to pull the lever and save everybody, or leave the lever alone and some number of people are harmed, um, what I do know, like, there's a chance that I pull the lever, the train has other issues, and at least one person gets harmed instead of zero, and like there's still the potential that I'm on the hook. So, and I think those two things kind of feed on each other. Like a
Yes.
legal system is meant to be reflective of the society. By the way,
Exactly.
I got a couple more things that I want to ask, and I have an upload limit of 3 hours, and I think that gives us about 20 to 20 minutes, maybe 30 minutes. Just FYI. That is unfortunate. It's a hard limit of my paid version of Riverside.
No worries.
um, yeah. Were you going to say something about the trolley problem?
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. So kind of the legal system certainly does reflect this like this valuation. If you want some good work on that, I would recommend reading some work from Dan Sneeser on it. Dan's awesome. But uh, in a lot of these instances, the our legal system is largely in the surface of kind of reflecting, how do we mitigate harm? And the thing is, as a species trying to cooperate, we want to minimize harm. And sometimes actually the legal system it creates a mismatch actually. So uh, kind of in the same vein of thinking, actually, another good person to consult on that would be Keela Williams. Keela is totally awesome. I love what she does. But basically, a lot of the times, our legal system is bore out of this idea of, uh, well, there's a mismatch. So at least with the U.S., our constitution is designed to keep things super fair. But the problem is sometimes that desire for fairness is at odds with the fact that there are certain laws that exist in the service of maintaining certain ancestral standards, mainly harm mitigation, and sometimes we actually see a bit of a conflict. Actually, some of my work with that legal system is in the service of trying to minimize harm. We actually may stereotype certain men as being unfit parents, and we actually kind of hold this against them for custody hearings, sentencing. One of my honor students and I, we actually did a really cool project where we showed that physically strong men actually can get shafted sometimes in legal proceedings just because they're physically strong. Even if it's the exact same crime committed by a physically weak man, we're going to hold the physically strong man more accountable, which again speaks to unfairness in the legal system. And there's other research showing that men with potentially more threatening faces or faces that are heuristically associated with untrustworthiness, they're more likely to experience the death penalty. My work shows too that, I mean, men with certain facial structures that appear more formidable, they're also less likely to receive favorable outcomes in custody hearings. Now, whether that translates into the real world, that there's just this inherent bias, at least in legal settings, to try to minimize possible harm that could also be at odds with the Constitution.
Yeah, that's those. Yeah, what's so interesting is those are the sort of subconscious things that are like that are inbred in what we'd expect. I mean, some of it goes back to like what we were talking about with the halo effect. If you look like you're a trustworthy person, you're going to get more favorable outcomes as the world will slightly conform around you, and those effects accumulate. So hit the gym and do leg day. I wanted to ask about the warrior mindset because we kind of we were talking about teams and stuff. And this is something I think about often. Is all the whole tribal nature and stuff, and I do wonder if the way we look at modern sports today, the way it's like so celebratory and it's just this multi-billion-dollar industry that captures a lot of people's attention. We got the World Cup going on now. There's like I think billions of viewers on that. It's like a third of the world, some wildly large numbers. And I think about how we we came to this state of affairs, and I do wonder if part of this is that warrior mindset where perhaps like during our tribal days there was a lot more there was a lot more conflict between tribes or within tribes, and being that sort of formidable aggressive person got you more gains, and I wonder if this fed into a large part of our civilized history where generals were celebrated. It was not uncommon for generals to be political leaders. Like, let's not forget George Washington was a general, and he was
Yep.
arguably I mean, it's hard to say he was not the best president of the U.S. He voluntarily stepped down after 2 terms and set that precedent without, that was not in the Constitution. That was not in the Bill of Rights. Washington said, "Hey, this is too much power. I've had enough. I don't need any more of this." They had to convince him to get in. But Julius Caesar, Marcus Aurelius, all these people were out there in the field conquering new lands, and that put them also in a position of leadership. And then now we when was the last time we see a president fight in a war? I think, and when was it in the
Well,
40s,
well,
30s?
I take that back. I mean, there were presidents who did serve. So the last president who actually served in combat, uh, I I want to say actually it was H.W. Bush, but also everyone was during World War II. I mean, Eisenhower was like he was a general, D-Day and all that. He was a bit of a populist in many ways. I hate to say this, but also one of the good populists. But then you had on Kennedy, he was on a PT. Nixon had his time serving the Navy too. Like, but yeah, just not since HW has there been a president who's actually served in war. And sometimes part of the reason why the Whig Party existed was because they wanted to have a president who would be commanding the army to have an appreciation for the cost of human life actually. And there's some concerns that at least among presidents who are going to send sometimes literal children to die. I mean, do they understand the consequences of what that is actually? I mean, I had great uncles who were 18, 19 years old who were storming Normandy, and just so like I kind of understood the consequences. He was a West Point grad. He got that, and just so just the idea being that just we don't really have leaders anymore who were actively serving. Then for some people that could be a bit of a a bit of a cost. And not necessarily saying that a president needs to be part of an actual military service. Personally, my dream president is an incredibly boring person who had never served, but also at the same time though, it just it does speak to the idea being that uh, the presidents who want to use military force, I mean, do they even have an appreciation of the consequences of that force?
Yeah, there's a I think that's a large component. I mean, my most controversial take, is that I actually think there is a benefit to requiring, say, all 18 to 20-year-olds to spend 1 or 2 years in basic training, and like to get involved with military, but that's never going to happen. There's a lot of implications to that, but the point being that it's I think it's a fascinating topic because on the one hand, I think being realistic about what war is and understanding what the consequences of those kind of actions are is I think it's important to kind of viscerally understand. On
Hmm.
the other hand, we are living in a time where warfare is a special case. I mean, obviously we still have it. It's a terrible thing, but it's not. It's like borders are not shifting every generation. The U.S. borders have been stable. When was the last big thing? I think in the 18 I can't I think the westward expansion was the last
Yeah,
big
yeah,
expansion, and that was
yeah.
in yeah.
Alsace-Lorraine has been in France for actually over 80 years now.
Sorry, what was that?
Alsace-Lorraine has been part of France for 80 years now, the longest it's ever been.
Oh, yeah, yeah, that's, it's on the German border, right?
Yep, yep. Depends on who wins the wars, either French or German.
Fair enough. But yeah, I mean, Europe has, I mean, studying European history is like the equivalent of studying warfare, with shifting borders, all these different languages, just like the boundaries are changing all the time. You have different empires, they come and go. I mean, one of the most interesting facts I came across recently was Poland was literally wiped off the map before
Mhm.
World War I. I think they came
Yep,
back on the map after World War I,
yep.
and
And
now
then they
like
left the map again.
yeah, yeah, well, yeah, and then they came back again, like the Warsaw
Yep.
Rising. It's a fascinating history, and all these like empires just kind of come and go, like languages fall out. Yeah, it's a crazy thing. But I do wonder, i- if that tribal warfare. I think again, I'm an optimist in general, but I wonder if it's fair to say that we are making progress in harnessing that. Um, and the evidence that I would like to submit is, warfare is now more of an exception than it is the standard, and I think our fervent support for sports is partially will replace that. And then the last position that I posit is, I wonder if tribal warfare and aggression has been partially used to fuel aggressive competitiveness in the business world, which is to say, to gather wealth in whatever form or fashion one wishes,
Yeah,
ideally in innovation.
yeah, yeah. That's an empirical question. One I'd like to answer. No, I think that actually that's a reasonable supposition. I would argue that this is a sanctioned way of doing things. So we oftentimes see what the so-called successful psychopath is someone who's able to navigate their environment in a callous way to help them gain favor. Obviously, we have the unsuccessful ones who are just kind of like a bit disorganized. Those are the ones who kind of end up incarcerated. But those who can keep it together, I mean, maybe historically, war was a way that kind of let them do those things, rise through the ranks. Maybe now this is just the ruthless tech lord. We saw this with the ruthless oil baron 200 years ago. So maybe this is the kind of a manifestation of that. Maybe just there's this is just another outlet through which dark personalities can kind of traverse through the world, where there's a degree of social acceptability, at least until they wear out their welcome and we start to sanction them.
Yeah, I do. I am. I would like to live forever, and part of that is to take an objective look at our state today. But also, I wonder if this would be kind of like we look at Alexander the Great. We call him the Great, and he was expanding Greece eastward, and actually, I think in all directions. There was Genghis Khan, who had this sort of ruthless nature about cities and villages he would overtake. And it's kind of funny that, like, there's also apologists on his side that say, oh, Genghis Khan was ruthless so that other people would just kind of submit, and he wouldn't have to kill them, without any contention or moral qualms. So I do, sometimes I think, like, maybe that the age of military expansion and exploration is now giving way to just a different push. I don't know. I mean, overall, I think it's fascinating what humans can achieve individually and collectively. And I still I hold a positive view of 100 years from now what we're going to look at in this day
Yeah.
and age.
Mhm. Yeah. Same. I mean, call me an optimist. I consider humans to be fundamentally good. I mean, there's a reason why we punish those who harm. Yeah, I mean, yeah, no matter how much some individuals may lose their damn mind in a given time, I do remain hopeful to be able to to think that things will still get better.
Well, Mitch, I've got one last thing that I have to bring up, and then we'll
Of
wrap it
course.
up, which is Mitch the Scientist.
I'm
So
Mr. Scientist. Oh boy. Yep. Yep. So yeah, I do. Those of you at home who don't live in Northwest Arkansas or remember me from 10 years ago in Southern Mississippi, yeah, I do stand up comedy, pretty much as the character Mr. Scientist, which is largely an extension of myself, taken to the most absurd conclusion. The character is essentially someone who is, for lack of a better phrase, trying to get laid, but takes his research far too literally and ends up in a wily coyote situation, where the only thing ultimately hurt in the end is his pride. Basically, most of my jokes are me taking evolutionary science far too literally and getting hurt.
see that can take you in so many different directions, and that's it's different than being a stand-up comedian with rocket science. Well, you could make a lot of innuendo with rocket science, but like that's kind of place that will get you into muddy water. I imagine, like, for all the reasons that we spoke about before.
Yeah. So lucky for me, I mean, most people kind of get what the joke is. Especially in just the Northwest Arkansas area, just people enjoy it. They get what it is. The biggest challenge is basically I speak very quickly, and oftentimes people don't have time to digest the punchlines, which is something I'm actively working on. By the way, yeah, just NWA friends listening right now. Yes, I'm trying, but my mouth moves very fast. But it's a lot of it is just people. They're kind of getting what's happening. And just people they there's an earnest attempt where people are just kind of aware of that, and obviously I do it in a way that doesn't convey any kind of creepiness. It's very obvious when I do the act. This is just me trying to do as absurd of a thing as possible, and I'll say just the most ridiculous things to make a point that make people laugh at it, and then I do something just brutally insane of basically how not to do this. So as an example of I'll talk about costly signaling. So going back to the whole peacock thing, the idea being I have displays of peacock status to demonstrate, the fact that I have good genes, and I explain why that is. I have charts sometimes. There's a mediation pathway that I drew out that for some reason people love it. But yeah, I'll explain that, and then I'll do things like I'll try to suck a table through a straw, and the joke is I'm hurting myself. I will try to wrestle myself on stage, have people hit me with a stick. I do really bad puppetry. For some reason, no, people enjoy the puppet. And then uh, actually going back to neck size, I wear a weight around my neck, and I do a whole act where I'm trying to strengthen my neck muscles, and I'm trying to say, "Oh, look at the good genes that I have, and I'm producing." And then basically, I end up hitting myself in the crotch with the weight at some point.
That's a lot of Schwartz. That's a lot of Schwartz you got.
Your Schwartz is as big as mine.
So, who are It's like, as you're kind of describing your act, the closest comedian I could think of, and this is not, I'm sure there's a lot of differences still, is Dimitri Martin. Do you remember Dimitri Martin?
I remember Demetri Martin. That guy was genius.
I don't know how he just he kinda came and then he went, you know, like, I think he had a couple of really good shows, then he had his TV show, and then he kinda fell off,
He's still touring. Like, yeah, I have friends who've seen him recently on tour, and he's great. But largely, I think he just made his money, and he's just trying to find ways to keep doing what he's doing and just still be relevant on a small scale. I mean, I don't think he really needs to worry about working that much.
alright, then I'm if he's kinda doing his own thing by like, if he's happy with what he's doing, I'm happy for him because I think he's
Yeah.
brilliant, but, how did you get into this? Like, what was your first, time on stage? Like
So that was about 10 years ago. One of my undergrads when I was in grad school basically told me that I need to go up there and do something. So I wrote out 5 minutes. Basically I told a story about bats performing oral sex on each other because bats actually do that. And I described it in such a horrific detail that people thought it was funny, and then I've just kind of made a whole character around it.
do they buy drinks to each other first, or like what does that look like? I'm not following how a bat
It's
seduces another bat to go down on him.
well, they go up on each other. Their bats are already upside down. It's well, well, yeah, just largely it's like in a more in a certain setting, animals can carry multiple spermatophore at any given time inside them, and basically it's the male bat performing cunnilingus, and and basically it's a way to displace rival sperm that could be existing in there, so that way only his sperm would exist when he was done.
Mhm.
And, the thing is, like, this is just kind of it's basically it's a mate retention tactic, which it kind of explains too why, oral sex is far more common in more committed pair bonds than it would be in less committed ones. Certainly can still happen, but it's just more common in something much more committed, at least in humans. It's not necessarily like a displacement thing at all. It's a way to, curry favor with somebody because it's such an intimate, very personal thing to do. Well, no, with bats, it's just it seems to be functional as a mate retention behavior, and I just came up with a few minutes on it, and I horrified everyone. And I kept making jokes based around well, a lot of things in science, oftentimes at my own expense. I would highlight my own weirdness, and then basically just say, "Please breathe with me." And for like 10 years, it's just been kind of that, just very casually. I've a lot of people in NWA comedy who would actually get the joke, and it's wonderful. And I've been very grateful to have chances to talk about things and refine my act. But yeah, just it's that's kind of what I've been doing.
In addition to horrifying the audience, you horrified the bat. Didn't
Exactly, that's right. Jeez,
Well
well,
well, the human version would be, to proclaim that sperm is good for skincare and for fat burning once it enters enters the stomach. So
oh my
there's
goodness.
ways to extend the analogy where, this is where we might be stepping on a pseudoscience, or there's an NSF grant waiting for some validation on this.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, 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 yeah. And, well, in this political climate, good luck on the grants. But that's also got kind of the beauty of Mitch the Scientist too, where I do kind of venture into a satire of pseudoscience. There are people who try to take research too literally, the looks maxers, the eugenicists, the people who say I got to do this, this, and this thing to demonstrate value, like your Dennis Reynolds. And basically, those people are horribly misguided. And I try as hard as I can to say, "Hey guys, this let's not have these things happen." I mean, for some reason, you guys find this endearing about myself, and just some people may enjoy Mr. Scientist quite a bit, but also too, there is a lot of satire in some of the subtext that I'm saying.
Very cool. Well, I try to find some of your stand up on YouTube, but it looks like there's another Mitch Brown that has been taking up some of the. Well, I don't think he's a comedian. Some guy from Australia who just
Yeah,
posts
yeah,
a lot of
Australian
videos.
football player. Yeah, the
Yeah.
story of my life, being overshadowed by another Mitch Brown who's very athletic. In high school, actually, there was another Mitch Brown who was basically the same name, obviously, and he was a football player, and I'm not necessarily a tall man, so football was not going to be in my purview. But just it was one of those things where just for years people would confuse me with the other Mitch Brown, and when I interviewed for my master's program on the phone, they said, "Hey, you're the Mitch Brown from Mentor, Ohio, right?" "Yeah, yeah." "Are you the one who played football?" "No." Um, and my master's advisor, Jack Bauer, loved Jack so much. He thought I was a football player. I think in the end he was still quite happy with me because that just ended up with a lifelong friend and collaborator. But yeah, just yeah, my online presence is oftentimes tampered by other Mitch Browns. So you have to type in Mitch Brown, Arkansas, or there are ways to find me. Just as an example, if you want to see my comedy more broadly, my Instagram is Ungeziefer, German word for vermin. So at UNGEZIEFER. If you want to see parts of my comedy and just the fantastic people who have been able to capture it, who turn my chaos into something coherent. And NWA has just been great to me for that. So if you were looking for some of my comedy and just video footage of that, it does exist in the ether. Just need to cut through all the other Mitch Browns.
Yeah, that's a good way to get through it all.
Yep. My Twitter, I'm not calling it X. My Twitter is extroverted face. You can also find me at spherelabar.weebly.edu. That's where you can find more about my research, more about my teaching information. Google Scholar me, Mitch Brown, Arkansas, just to make sure you don't get any other Mitch Browns. Yeah, those are the primary areas, and also you can just reach me by email, mb103@uark.edu. I'm always available to chat. I'm flattered if you want to ask questions about my papers. Always happy to do things. Science needs to be open and transparent, so let's keep that going.
Awesome. Well, Mitch, thanks a lot for hopping on. Stick around for a second. I'm going to cut the recording, but
Sure,
we'll let
yeah.
the upload go.
Absolutely.